The walls on either side are built of large squared blocks that fit so tightly the mortar lines appear as mere hairline shadows, dark grey and slightly damp near the ground where the stone draws moisture from the earth. In places the surface is pitted and rough, freckled with a dry, olive-coloured lichen that has spread in irregular patches no larger than a thumbnail, and higher up are faint black staining marks where generations of rain have dribbled from a broken gutter, leaving a vertical trace like watered ink. The worn is cool to the eye, a colour somewhere between silver and charcoal, and it looms without menace, simply present as it has been for hundreds of years. Your gaze can travel slowly over the individual blocks, noting the tiny chisel marks left by the stonemason who squared them, a series of parallel grooves that catch the weep light and release it again. Above you the sky is a narrow ribbon of pale cloud, visible only as a strip, no wider than a handspan from where you stand. It has lightened in the last half hour from a deep slate to a grey, so soft it holds the faintest hint of cream, as if the sun somewhere far above the canopy of cloud is pressing gently against the world, unable to break through, but able to lift the darkness inch by inch. The light that reaches the floor of the close is a thin, diffuse wash that does not cast shadows, only lifts the blackness into a dim grey-blue that allows your eyes to distinguish the outlines of doorways and stone steps. It arrives as a quiet presence, patient and unobtrusive, and it asks nothing of the day. Your footfall, when you take a gentle step forward, is a soft and flat sound, your leather sole pressing the polished cobble with a quiet hush that does not echo. The sound folds into the silence as a stone folds into still water, a small event that is immediately gone. You pause, and the silence returns fuller than before, a heavy, cottony stillness that presses gently on your ears and makes the distant sounds of the city seem very far away, like voices heard through a closed door. From the high street above comes the slow turning of a cartwheel, its iron rim grinding against the setts with a low, continuous rumble that you feel through your shoes before you hear it. The cart moves off with no hurry, the sound unwinding like a length of coarse thread pulled slowly through a needle, and then it is gone, leaving only the deep quiet of the close. The quiet itself has texture. It is made of the cool morning, the damp stones, the weight of so many walls, and it rests over everything like a glass bell. Somewhere not far along the passage, a wooden shutter is unlatched. The sound is a single, muffled thud of wood meeting stone, followed by the dry scrape of a bolt being drawn back with a deliberate, unhurried motion. You can almost picture the hand that did it, a hand that has performed this task so many times it requires no thought, the fingers moving to the iron latch, lifting, sliding, letting the shutter settle into its frame. The noise does not startle. It simply occurs, a punctuation mark in the long sentence of the morning, and then the silence flows back around it. You turn your attention to the ground again, observing the arrangement of the cobblestones. They are a muted mosaic of greys, browns, and the faintest moss green, laid in a pattern that is not random, but not quite ordered either. A careful puzzle solved by long-ago hands. Some stones are large and flat, as wide as two of your palms placed side by side, while others are smaller and rounded like river pebbles, but all have been worn smooth, their edges softened so that they fit together with a kind of geological patience. In the cracks between them, dry, packed dirt has settled over the years, and here and there a single strand of straw lies pressed into a seam, dropped from a bundle carried through the close weeks ago, and now a part of the ground itself, still and brittle. The central gutter is a shallow channel of slightly darker stone, its surface smoother still from the passage of rainwater, and even though it is dry now, it carries the faint metallic scent of old water and iron, cool and ancient. A thin cat walks down the center of the passage, its fur a muted tabby whose stripes are barely legible in the low light, its movements so fluid they seem to take no effort at all. One small silent paw lifts and sets down, then the next, each placement deliberate and soundless, the claws retracted, the body low. It passes within an arm's reach of you, its head low and its tail held straight, and it does not glance left or right, does not acknowledge your presence, simply moves along the gutter, a creature wholly of the close and its quiet. It reaches a slight bend in the passage, where a protruding stair turret creates a pocket of deeper shadow, and its outline dissolves into that darkness without a sound, leaving behind no trace except the memory of its passing, which itself begins to fade like a breath on glass. Now your eyes adjust further, and you notice the doorways that line the close, each one a dark, low rectangle of heavy oak, fitted with iron hinges that have been blackened by age and flecked with rust, no larger than the head of a pin. One door stands slightly ajar, and from its opening comes the unmistakable scent of damp wool, warm and musty. The smell of old coats stored for a season in a trunk, thick and absorbent. The scent mingles with the peat smoke and the cold stone, creating a single quiet fragrance that is the true smell of the close at dawn, a fragrance that you breathe in without thinking and that settles deep in your chest, calm and familiar. You can hear nothing from behind that door, not a voice nor a movement, only the slow, patient presence of the wall itself, piled and still. You take another step, and the ground descends gently, the slope so gradual that you might not notice it if you were not paying close attention, a shallow gradient that ancient rainwater carved into the stone, guiding the flow toward the lower end of the close where it spills into the cowgate. Your foot finds a shallow stone step, a single riser worn into a soft, sway-backed curve in the middle where countless feet have landed over centuries, and you step down, the change in level no more than 3 inches. The close continues, and now the walls are subtly different, the stone here bearing the faint, rectangular ghost of a sign that once hung above a shop front, its iron bracket still projecting from the mortar, rusted and silent. The light has not changed. It remains that same steady, low grey wash, a light that does not hurry. You look up at the window openings that punctuate the walls, most of them dark squares of thick, bubbled glass that reflect the pale sky in a muted, silvery sheen. On the 3rd story, however, a single small pane glows with the soft amber of a candle flame burning behind it. The light so steady and small it must be set on a shelf near the glass, tended by someone who has perhaps gone to another room. That little flame becomes a point of stillness. In the stillness, a single warm note in the cool grey scale of the close, and you find your gaze returning to it as you breathe, noting how it neither flickers nor dims, just burns with quiet constancy. Then, after a time that might be 5 minutes or 15, the light goes out, not with a sputter, but simply ceases, leaving the window as dark as the others. The close accepts this without any change whatsoever. The air shifts now, bringing a new thread of scent, this one the cool, clean smell of damp linen, as if somewhere above a woman has carried a basket of washed cloth to a window to air it. The smell comes and then fades, replaced again by that steady base of stone and peat and wool. You let your shoulders drop, and your breathing slows to match the rhythm of the close, a rhythm that is not marked by a clock, but by the slow lightening of the sky and the occasional small sound that arrives and departs like a drifting seed. You notice the iron boot scraper set into the wall, a simple curved bar of blackened metal whose surface has been polished bright in a thin line along its top edge by innumerable shoes scraped across it before entering a doorway. The stone around it is worn as well, a shallow depression where feet have stood, and the ground beneath is slightly darker from the mud and water that once fell there. It is a small detail, a thing of daily use that now sits idle in the dawn, and it tells a story without telling a story of mornings just like this one repeated across decades. After another while, you become aware of a sound that has been beneath everything else, a sound so faint and so steady that it is almost a part of the silence itself. It is a single soft tap, like the note of a very small bell struck with a pad of felt, coming from somewhere ahead inside one of the ground floor workshops that face the close. The tap repeats after a long pause, then another, each sound a tiny metallic tick that floats into the still air and dissolves, leaving behind a silence that seems thicker by contrast. It is the first tap of a cobbler's hammer, the beginning of a workday so quiet and slow that it barely rises above the level of silence. You listen, and after a sequence of your own calm breaths, the tap comes again, unhurried, precise, as gentle as a heartbeat. You do not move toward it. You remain exactly where you are, the cool morning holding you in place, and you let the sound settle around you. The tap becomes a fixture, a tiny pulse that measures the morning without urgency, and the close receives it as it receives all things, with a deep and patient stillness. The sky above continues its imperceptible journey toward noon. The ribbon of cloud now trimmed with a white so pale it is nearly silver, and the walls carry that new light without comment. You stand in the narrow space, your weight even on both feet, and there is nothing else to do, nowhere else to be. Only the long, slow reveal of the ordinary day, the quiet stone, the cool, wool-scented air, and that first gentle tapping that will go on for hours, shaping leather and iron into something useful, something needed. Piece by patient piece, you step through the low doorway, and the cool, wool-scented air of the close gives way to a warmer stillness, a stillness that has been sealed inside these stone walls since the previous evening. The workshop is a single ground-floor room, its ceiling a low vault of exposed beams darkened by smoke and time, and the floor beneath you is laid with wide flagstones that have been worn into shallow, polished basins by the shuffle of countless feet. The light comes from a single small window set deep into the thick wall, its glass panes thick and bubbled, gathering the grey morning into a soft, diffuse glow that touches the far side of the room and leaves the corners in permanent dusk. The window looks out at the close at eye level, but offers no view. Only the dark stone of the opposite wall, and the faint suggestion of movement when someone passes by. A shadow that briefly dims the light and then releases it again without hurry. In the center of this quiet room stands the cobbler's workbench, and it is to this object that your attention now turns as naturally as water finds a hollow. The bench is old, older than any living hand can remember, built of oak that has darkened over decades from a pale honey to a deep, smoky brown shot through, with fine black lines of grain. The top is a single thick slab, nearly 3 inches deep, its edges gently rounded from years of sleeves brushing past and hands resting upon them while the mind considers the next small task. The surface is not rough, but neither is it polished. It has been worn to a particular soft smoothness that comes only from the constant, patient friction of leather, wax, and human skin, a patina that is more felt than seen. Across this surface spreads a faint map of shallow scratches and tiny nicks, each one a record of a blade that slipped or an awl that skidded long ago. But so fine are these marks that they blend into the dark wood like lines on a palm, visible only if you lean close and let your eyes adjust to their subtle language. Beneath the top, the bench frame is held together with thick wooden pegs and dovetail joints that have held firm through summer heat and winter damp, and a single wide drawer with a wooden pull sits directly under the work surface, its front face worn smooth around the knob from the unconscious grip of many fingers. On either side, open shelves hold stacks of leather pieces cut into rough sole shapes, their edges raw and pale, alongside coils of twine and small clay pots sealed with wooden lids. The floor directly before the bench has its own gentle hollow, an oval depression in the flagstone where the cobbler and his apprentices before him have planted their feet hour after hour, year after year, and the stone there is a shade darker than the rest, polished by the steady friction of leather soles that never moved far. Beside the bench sits the stool, and it is a thing of quiet ingenuity, a 3-legged seat carved from a single block of ash that has been shaped to fit the human form without any excess. The seat is a shallow curve, cupped slightly at the back and sloping down at the front, so that a person settling onto it finds their weight distributed without thought, their thighs allowed to angle gently toward the floor, their lower back finding a calm support that asks nothing in return. The surface of the seat is dark, with the same patina that marks the bench, but here the wear is deeper, a softly polished hollow in the exact shape of a body that has sat there through thousands of patient hours, the wood grain emerging as a series of fine, flowing ridges that catch the grey light and release it as a faint, silky sheen. The 3 legs are plain and sturdy, each ending in a small, flat pad that rests on the flagstone, and they have been pegged into the seat at angles so precise that the stool never wobbles, never tilts, simply waits with a patient solidity. Your gaze drifts across the bench and settles on the tools laid out upon it, each one resting in the place where the cobbler left it the night before. They are arranged not with fussy precision, but with the quiet order that comes from daily use, an order that places each item within the natural reach of a seated person's hand. Nearest the front edge lies the lasting pincer, a tool built for gripping and pulling, its 2 wooden handles worn to a deep, oily brown where palms have pressed and squeezed. The handles are turned from beech, each one shaped like a rounded rod that swells slightly in the middle and tapers at the ends, and they fit together when the pincer is closed like two halves of a single branch that parted long ago. At the business end, the iron jaws curve outward in a pair of blunt hooks, their inner faces textured with fine cross-hatching to grip the leather without tearing it, and the metal has taken on a dark grey patina speckled with infinitesimal dots of darker oxidation, each one no larger than a grain of sand. The pivot pin that joins the two halves is a simple iron rivet that has been hammered flat and smooth, and it moves with a whisper of oil when the pincer is opened and closed, a sound so quiet you must lean close to hear it at all. Next to the pincer, lying parallel with the bench edge, is the trimming knife. This tool demands a longer moment of attention because it is the most elegant thing on the bench, its blade a long, slender curve of polished steel that tapers to a wicked but quiet point. The steel has been honed so many times that a shallow, moon-like hollow runs down the center of each face, catching the light in a soft, silver gleam that rolls along the metal as you tilt your head. The cutting edge is a hair-thin line of brighter silver, and it runs from the curved tip back toward the tang without a single nick or roll, kept perfect by a leather strop that hangs from a peg on the wall. The handle is ash, dark with oil, shaped into a gentle swell that fits the curve of the palm, and it is held to the tang by a brass ferrule that is mellowed to a dull buttery gold, its surface lightly scratched with tiny circular marks where a cloth has polished it. The blade rests in a sheath of thick, dark leather, stitched along one side with waxed thread that is frayed just slightly at the end, and this sheath sits loosely on the knife, ready to be drawn off with a single, easy motion. Behind the knife, against the dark wood, rests the ball of hemp twine. It is no larger than a small apple, wound neatly around a hollow core, and the fibers are a pale golden brown threaded with darker flecks of the original plant stalk. The twine is coarse to the eye, its surface made of countless short, rough fibers that twist together in a two-ply spiral, and the free end has been tucked under the last winding to keep it from unraveling. A faint, dusty scent rises from it, the smell of dried plant matter and the faint oil from the hands that have pulled lengths of it. Cut it with the knife, and waxed it with a lump of beeswax kept nearby. The wax itself sits in a shallow wooden dish just behind the twine, a lump of pale amber substance that has been softened and shaped by the press of warm fingers into a shape like a small, flattened stone. Its surface is matte where it has been handled and glossy where it has been broken, and tiny thumbprint holes are visible in its substance, preserved in the wax like the traces of ancient insects in amber. A single length of waxed twine already prepared lies across the bench in a loose curve, its fibers dark and stiff with the coating, ready to be threaded through a needle when the time comes. Beyond these items, against the far side of the bench top, stands a row of curved awls. They are set upright into a small block of scrap leather that holds them like a pincushion, their sharp points buried and their handles fanning outward in a careful arc. Each awl is different in size and curve, some with a gentle shallow bend that would suit the stitching of a sole, others with a sharper, more acute hook meant for drawing thread through tough heel leather, and their handles are of various woods, beech and ash, and one of dark, dense rosewood that stands out among its paler neighbours. The steel of the awl shafts is blued from tempering, a deep smoky colour that holds the grey light in a soft leaden gleam, and the points are so fine they disappear into the leather block as if into butter, leaving only the faintest puncture marks. The handles have been shaped to fit the palm, some with a rounded ball end, others with a flat paddle shape, but all share the same deep, hand-darkened patina that speaks of decades of steady use. On a small shelf just above the bench, within easy arm's reach, sits a row of clay pots sealed with wooden plugs, each containing a different substance needed for the work. One holds tallow for lubricating the awl points and stiffening the thread. Its contents are pale, cloudy fat that hardens in the cool morning air. Another holds iron filings mixed with wax for polishing the blades. A third holds a dark resinous pitch used in tiny dabs to secure knots. The pots are plain and unglazed, their surface is rough like dried mud, and the wooden plugs are simple rounds of pine that have split slightly with age, their cracks now dark with the substances they seal. The small hammer with the ash handle rests at the very edge of the bench, its head placed on a folded square of scrap leather to keep the metal from marring the wood. The hammer is not large. Its head is no longer than your middle finger, forged from iron and left with the coarse, dark grey skin of the forge, a texture like old bark. The striking face is slightly domed and polished to a dull silver from thousands of soft impacts with hobnail heads, and around its circumference runs a tiny chamfer, a beveled edge that catches the light. The eye where the handle meets the head is fitted so tightly that no wedge is visible, only a thin dark line where wood turns to iron. The handle itself is ash, pale and straight-grained, shaped into a gentle oval cross-section that feels cool and smooth in the hand, its surface lightened by the constant light friction of a palm sliding up and down its length. At the end of the handle, a small hole has been drilled and through it passes a loop of thin leather cord, dark with age, which allows the hammer to be hung on a peg when not in use. Your gaze now takes in the entire bench again, seeing the tools as a single quiet composition, a still life of wood and iron and leather that has arranged itself over lifetimes. The low ceiling above, the grey light falling on the dark oak, the faint smell of tallow and beeswax and old wood, all combine into a calm, unchanging presence that fills the room like a slow breath held indefinitely. Nothing moves, nothing creaks, and the silence is not empty but full, a silence made of solid things, quietly waiting. It is into this silence that the apprentice now arrives. You do not hear his footsteps in the close, because he walks with the light, flat-footed care of someone who rose before others and has no wish to disturb the morning. The door moves open a few more inches, with a soft, woody sound, and he enters sideways, his body slim and young, dressed in a plain linen shirt that has been washed so many times it is the color of oatmeal, the sleeves rolled just above his wrists. Over the shirt he wears a leather apron that reaches his knees, its surface dark and burnished by years of use before it came to him, marked with faint stains of tallow and polish, and the ghostly outline of a pocket where a pair of shears once rested. His hair is a quiet brown, cut simply, and he does not look up or around, because there is nothing here that he does not already know, no detail that would surprise him. He crosses the short distance to the bench with the ease of long habit. His steps so practiced, they make no sound on the flagstones, and he settles onto the stool with a single fluid motion that does not jolt the bench or rattle the tools. His body conforms to the worn hollow of the seat as a key conforms to a lock, his weight adjusting without a creak, and he allows his hands to rest for a moment on the front edge of the bench, the fingers spread lightly on the dark wood, feeling its cool, smooth surface. He breathes out once, a quiet exhaling that merges with the stillness, and then he reaches below the bench to the open shelf where a pair of half-finished workman's boots waits. The boots are sturdy things, built of thick, brownish leather that has been shaped over a last and left to cure, the uppers already stitched to the welts with the neat, diagonal stitches of a waxed thread line. The soles are attached but not yet finished. They are rough, pale slabs of sole leather, their surfaces unscored and unmarked, waiting for the hobnails that will convert them from flat, vulnerable leather into a protective, gripping layer between the workman's foot and the cobbles of the city. The apprentice takes one boot in his left hand, his fingers wrapping around the heel seat, and he sets it on the bench before him with the sole facing upward, a blank field of thick, dense fibre that smells faintly of the tannery pit, and something else, something like old bark and water and time. He does not reach immediately for the hammer. Instead he turns the boot slowly, examining the sole's surface, running a thumb across the pale leather to feel its evenness. His nail finds a small hard inclusion, a tiny lump of something that must be scraped away, and he does this with the edge of his thumbnail, a small precise movement that removes the flaw without marking the surrounding material. He blows a gentle breath across the spot, and the tiny scrap of leather dust lifts and settles on the bench, so small it is nearly invisible. Then he sets the boot down with its sole flat on the bench, and he turns his attention to the hobnail box, a wooden container no larger than his two palms held together, its lid sliding open with a dry, quiet rasp. Inside, hundreds of hobnails lie in a dark, jumbled heap, each one a tiny iron pyramid on a short, square shaft, their surfaces covered in the soft, dark grey bloom of forged scale that has not yet worn away. He picks one up, holds it between his thumb and forefinger, and studies it as if it were the first hobnail ever made, though he has held thousands. Then he sets the nail on the sole, positioning it near the outer edge of the heel waist, its tiny point just touching the leather, and he reaches for the hammer. His fingers wrap around the ash handle, the familiar oval shape settling into his palm, and he lifts the hammer from its leather rest with a motion so gentle the iron head makes no sound. He pauses, his arm relaxed, the hammer poised, and the workshop remains utterly still around him, holding its breath in the low grey light. Then he brings the hammer down in a soft, guiding tap that is more a placing of the nail than a driving of it, and the first small tick of the workday rings through the quiet like a stone dropped into deep water, a single note that marks the beginning of a long, slow rhythm that will fill the morning and the afternoon and the early evening, until the light fails and the bench is cleared once more. The first hobnail of the morning lies on the upraised sole of the workman's boot, a tiny iron form no larger than a grain of barley, yet already it seems to contain the entire weight of the day that will unfold around it. You watch the apprentice as he holds the nail between his right thumb and the side of his forefinger, feeling its small shape with the same calm attention that a reader might give to a familiar word on a page. The nail is cool against his skin, the temperature of the workshop air that has not yet been touched by any warmth of sun or fire, and the slight roughness of its surface presses into the ridges of his fingertip, a texture that is partly the forge scale that coats the iron, a dark grey, microfine grit, and partly the tiny irregularities left by the mould in which the nail was cast. The apprentice does not hurry this moment of contact, but instead turns the nail slowly in his grip, rotating it a quarter turn so that the light from the small window falls across its pyramid-shaped head, revealing the 4 triangular facets that slope upward to a softly pointed apex. Each facet a flat plane of dark metal that catches the grey glow in a single, muted gleam. You note that the head is not perfectly symmetrical. One facet is slightly wider than its opposite, a small asymmetry that will disappear into the leather and never be noticed again. A private imperfection known only to the hand that placed it and the soul that receives it. Beneath the head, the shaft extends for no more than 1/8 of an inch, a square-cut length of iron that was sheared from a longer rod by a single decisive stroke of a larger hammer in a noisy forge somewhere far from this quiet close. The cut end is not smooth, but shows the slightly ragged crystalline grain of the metal, a surface that catches the light in a scatter of tiny, bright points, like the smallest possible stars against a dark sky. The apprentice runs the pad of his thumb across this end, not to test the sharpness, for the shaft is blunt enough to press but not cut, but simply to know the nail completely before he commits it to the leather. This small inventory of sensation, the cool metal, the rough texture, the precise geometry of head and shaft, takes no more than a handful of slow breaths to complete, and yet within the stillness of the workshop it seems to occupy a much longer space, a small eternity of patience that has no need of clocks. He lowers the nail toward the sole. The leather is pale and dense, a slab of cowhide that has been compressed by rollers and cured in a pit of tannin-rich bark until it has become a material that can stand between a man's foot and the wet cobbles for a year of daily walking without crumbling. Its surface, seen this close, is not blank but alive with tiny features, the faint microscopic pores where hair once grew, the shallow undulating grain lines that trace the animal's life, the small soft scratches left by the trimming knife when the sole was cut to shape. The apprentice has chosen a spot near the edge of the heel waist, that narrow part of the sole just forward of the heel block where the curve of the boot cinches inward before widening again at the ball of the foot. This is a place that will bear the workman's weight in a particular, concentrated way when he leans back on his heels or braces himself on a sloping street. And so the nails here must be set with a precise spacing that the apprentice knows from long practice but could not easily explain in words, a knowledge held in the muscles of his hands and the steady patience of his gaze. He places the point of the hobnail against the chosen spot, holding the shaft absolutely vertical so that the tiny flat tip presses into the leather with no initial penetration, simply dimpling the surface by the weight of the nail alone. He checks this placement with a single eye, sighting down the length of the nail as a carpenter sights a plumb line, and you notice that the point aligns with a faint pencil mark on the sole, a thin, silvery line of graphite that was drawn along the edge as a guide for the outer row of hobnails, a boundary that will keep the iron heads neatly spaced and parallel to the welt. The mark is faint, visible only from a certain angle, and already a little smudged by the apprentice's thumb, but it serves as a patient, silent instruction that will be followed nail by nail until the entire pattern is complete. Now the apprentice reaches for the hammer. His left hand steadies the boot on the bench, the fingers spread around the heel and the ball, pressing the sole flat against the dark oak. The right hand wraps around the ash handle, the familiar oval cross-section settling into the hollow of his palm, and he lifts the hammer just far enough that the iron head rises an inch above the nail. There is no preparatory swing, no tensing of the arm, only a simple, direct lift and a controlled descent that brings the polished face of the hammer down onto the apex of the pyramid head. The contact produces a sound so quiet it is less a tap than a tick, a small, sharp, metallic note that occupies the air for no longer than a heartbeat before the silence absorbs it. The nail point has entered the leather by no more than a hair's breadth, the square shaft just beginning to part the dense fibers, and the head now rests with one facet angled very slightly forward, having tilted under the hammer's touch. The apprentice sees this tilt immediately, a misalignment so small that only an eye trained by years of looking could detect it, and he does not frown or sigh, but simply withdraws the hammer, resting the head back on its leather pad, and uses the tip of his left forefinger to nudge the nail upright again, a movement as gentle as coaxing a fallen petal back into place. He breathes once, a slow, even breath that you can see in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders under the linen shirt, and then he lifts the hammer a second time. The strike that follows is a deliberate repetition of the first, a controlled soft tap that returns the nail to the exact spot where it began its shallow journey. This time the hobnail remains upright, its head now exactly parallel with the leather surface, and the point has driven a little deeper, perhaps half the length of the shaft, a depth that holds the nail firmly enough to stand without support, but not so deep that it cannot be withdrawn if a fault is found. The apprentice runs the ball of his thumb over the head to feel the tiny projection that remains above the leather, a dome of iron no taller than a piece of heavy paper, and he judges this height to be correct, a height that will require one more, slightly firmer tap to seat the head flush. The hammer lifts for the third time, rising the same inch, descending on the same vertical path, but the force applied to the handle is now a fraction greater, a tiny, incremental increase that comes from a subtle tightening of the forearm muscles, enough to drive the head down the remaining distance and sink the pyramid flush with the leather surface. The sound this time is a small, clean thock, a note slightly deeper than the earlier ticks because the iron head now lies in firm contact with the leather rather than projecting above it, and the vibration of the impact travels from the nail into the boot, from the boot into the bench, and from the bench into the floor. A tiny tremor that you might feel through your own feet if you were standing close enough. A tremor that is not a sound, but the memory of a sound. Gone before you can fully register it. The apprentice sets the hammer down on its leather rest and leans back the merest fraction, his spine straightening against the curved support of the stool. He regards the first hobnail with a still, unhurried attention, checking that the head is indeed flush, that the surrounding leather is not puckered or raised, that the angle remains true to the pencil line. The nail head now sits as a small dark star embedded in the pale sole, its four facets catching the grey light at different angles and creating a tiny cross-shaped highlight that shifts as you tilt your head. The metal has compressed the leather around it into a tight ring, a faint halo of denser, darker fibre that marks the boundary between iron and hide. And this ring will, over the life of the boot, be polished by friction with the ground until it becomes an almost invisible part of the patina. For now, though, it is a fresh mark, the first of many, and it stands as a quiet monument to the morning's beginning. The apprentice now lifts his left hand from the boot and uses it to turn the boot slightly on the bench, rotating the sole so that the next position in the outer row comes into easy view. This rotation is slow and careful, the leather sole sliding across the oak with a faint, dry whisper, and when the boot is settled in its new orientation, he does not immediately pick up another nail, but pauses, his hands resting on the edge of the bench, his eyes gazing at the place where the next nail will go. This pause is not empty time, but a different kind of work, a work of measuring and imagining, of calculating the distance between the first nail and the second based on the curve of the edge, the thickness of the leather, and the requirements of a life spent walking on stone. The measurement is not marked on the sole, no ruler lies on the bench, no scratches indicate the span. The apprentice simply knows, in the way that a musician knows the interval between two notes without counting the steps, and after a moment, that might be 10 seconds or might be 30, he reaches into the hobnail box and selects a second nail. This second hobnail is identical to the first in all visible respects, a pyramid head on a square shaft, cool and rough with forged scale, and yet the apprentice turns it over in his fingers just as carefully, feeling its shape, noting its slight individual variations, absorbing its small particularity before he lowers it to the sole. He places its point at a distance from the first nail that is exactly 2 nail heads wide, a gap that will allow each iron pyramid to do its work of gripping the ground without crowding its neighbor. And he holds it vertical while he checks the alignment with the pencil line and with the first nail, ensuring that the 2 heads will sit in a clean, even row. His breathing remains slow and even, the same steady rhythm that has governed the morning since he entered the workshop, and the silence of the room stretches around him like a comfortable, familiar fabric. The first tap of the second nail is another tick, a soft setting of the point into the leather's surface. The apprentice checks the angle, finds it true, and follows with the second tap, which seats the shaft halfway and leaves the head riding above the surface by that same minute projection. A pause, a breath, and the third tap follows. The slightly firmer blow that sinks the head flush, its sound a small thock that merges with the previous sound in your memory, so that you cannot quite separate one from the other. The second nail now sits beside the first, 2 dark stars embedded in the pale leather, and the apprentice sets the hammer down once more, his movements unhurried and without wasted motion, his body still and calm on the worn wooden stool. You notice now that the light in the workshop has undergone a subtle shift. The grey of the window having lightened by a single increment as the sun, invisible behind the tenement roofs, continues its slow, imperceptible climb above the city. The change is so slight that you cannot point to a moment when it happened, only that the surfaces of the tools seem a shade brighter, the dark grain of the oak bench a degree more visible, the pale sole of the workman's boot now showing its tan colour with a little more warmth than before. Dust motes, invisible until this moment, hang in the air above the bench, tiny specks of leather and wood and wool that drift in stately, random spirals, catching the light for a second before fading into the darker background of the far wall. The apprentice pays no attention to them, his focus entirely on the leather and the nails and the small repeating task that occupies his hands. He selects a third hobnail, then a fourth, then a fifth, each one receiving the same quiet ritual of inspection, placement, the 3 soft hammer taps, and the pause that follows. The rhythm of the work is like a slow breath drawn in 3 parts, the tick of the first guiding tap, the tick of the second seating tap, and the thock of the final flush tap, followed by a rest that allows the sound to fade before the next begins. This rhythm is not metronomic, but organic, varying slightly with each nail according to the density of the leather at that particular spot, the slight variations in the iron, and the apprentice's own internal tempo, which slows and quickens by barely perceptible degrees as his mind settles more deeply into the task. Sometimes a nail requires a 4th tap, because the leather is especially dense near the edge, and the apprentice delivers this extra tap with no more force than the others, simply an additional gentle nudge that seats the stubborn head that final fraction of an inch. Sometimes a nail sinks into a slightly softer patch of fibre and needs only 2 taps, the head sliding home with an ease that requires the third firmer strike to be omitted entirely, replaced by a gentle press of the thumb that finishes the job in near silence. With each nail placed, the outer row extends by 1 small iron star, and the pattern of the hobnails begins to reveal itself as a sweeping curve that follows the outline of the sole from the heel waist toward the toe. This curve is a quiet geometry, a segment of a larger ellipse that matches the shape of the human foot as it rolls through a step, and the apprentice traces it without conscious calculation, his hand moving along the pencil line as a pen follows a ruled guide. The heads of the nails, now a dozen, now 15, catch the light in a scattered constellation of tiny dark gleams, their facets each a small mirror that reflects not an image but a point of brightness, and the soul that was a blank field of pale leather a quarter of an hour ago is now a mapped territory, its boundaries marked in iron. The apprentice pauses for a longer moment, reaching for a scrap of cloth that lies on the bench near the tallow pot. He wipes his fingertips, which have gathered a fine dark dust from the forged scale of so many nails, and he rubs the cloth over the heads of the nails he has set, a gentle polishing motion that removes any loosened scale and burnishes the iron to a faint, even sheen. The cloth catches on one nail head, a tiny snag of a fibre, and he frees it with a patient tug, smoothing the leather around the nail with his thumb afterward to erase any mark. This done, he folds the cloth and sets it aside, and his hands return to the hobnail box, his eyes already measuring the next position along the row. The sound of the hammer has now become part of the workshop's silence, a sound so regular and soft that you stop hearing it as a separate event and instead perceive it as a thread running through the stillness, a thread that weaves the quiet into a fabric of small, measured beats. The air remains cool and still, the scent of tallow and leather and old wood unchanged, and the view through the small window remains a grey rectangle of stone and cloud. Nothing outside the workshop has altered, and nothing inside has altered either, except for the slow, patient accumulation of hobnails in the sole of the workman's boot, a task that proceeds at its own calm pace, governed by nothing but the steady hand and the quiet mind of the apprentice on his three-legged stool. The apprentice continues along the outer row, his right hand moving from the bench to the nail box and back again with a slow, absent rhythm that seems to require no thought. The small iron nails are indistinguishable from one another in the wooden compartment, a dark jumble of identical forms, and yet each time his fingers close around one, they do so with a gentle, searching pressure that tests the tiny shape against his skin, confirming its soundness by touch alone. He does not need to look at the box. His eyes remain on the leather sole, tracing the faint silver line of the pencil mark as it curves away from the heel waist toward the widest part of the foot, and his left hand holds the boot steady with a grip that is firm but never tense, the heel pressed into the oak and the toe cradled by his palm. You watch the row grow longer, nail by patient nail, and the pattern becomes a quiet map of the working day's first hour. The hammer rises and falls in its small, measured arc. The tap of the first guiding contact, the second tap that deepens the bite, and the third that seats the pyramid head flush with the leather. These three sounds have blended into a single, familiar phrase that repeats itself with the regularity of a calm exhalation. There is no hurry in the tempo. The apprentice allows a full breath between each nail, sometimes a breath and a half, as if the rhythm were being set by a slow internal pendulum that swings at the pace of resting thought. The tick and thock of the hammer merge with the heavy stillness of the workshop, and the sound becomes so much a part of the quiet that it is no longer a separate event, only a texture, a fine grain running through the silence. His attention never wanders from the soul, yet it does not strain either. It rests on the leather with a soft, diffused focus that takes in the whole curve at once, the pencil line, the set of the nail heads already placed, and the empty space ahead where the next nails will go, all perceived together as a single composition. He sees when a nail head stands a fraction too proud, the thin line of shadow beneath the pyramid betraying the gap, and he corrects it with a fourth tap, so light it seems to be a caress, the hammerhead bouncing back immediately without a sound. He sees when two adjacent nails have drifted a hair closer than the ideal spacing, a tiny crowding of the iron stars, and he compensates by moving the next nail a corresponding distance outward, restoring the evenness of the arc with a slight, invisible adjustment that no eye but his would detect. These small corrections are not mistakes, simply the slow conversation between hand and material, the slight back and forth of intention and result, that makes the finished work settle into something that feels right, without any obvious reason. The outer row now extends beyond the heel waist, and enters the long, nearly straight section that runs along the side of the sole, beneath the ball of the foot. Here the curve flattens into a gentle, almost imperceptible bow, and the apprentice's hand follows it, placing the nails in a sequence that seems to anticipate the shape before it arrives. The leather in this region is slightly thicker, the compressed fibers of the cowhide having been layered and pressed in a different direction, and the nails meet a subtle resistance that requires the third tap to be applied with a tiny incremental firmness. Not a heavier blow, but a slower one, the hammer accelerating through a longer, more deliberate stroke that pushes the shaft through the tough outer crust of the hide. The sound changes in consequence, the final thock deepening by a tone, a slightly duller note that is absorbed more quickly by the leather, and then the next nail returns the sound to its normal pitch as the fiber softens again. You might notice, if you watched with the same patient attention, that the soles of the apprentice's own shoes rest flat on the worn flagstone, the left foot slightly ahead of the right, and that his back maintains a gentle curve that matches the shape of the stool, his shoulders relaxed downward, his neck inclined forward without stiffness. He does not shift his weight or stretch or rub his eyes. His entire body has entered a state of quiet suspension, a working rest in which only the hands and forearms move, and even they move within a small economical range that wastes nothing. The apron over his knees has gathered a faint sprinkling of iron scale, tiny dark specks that cling to the burnished leather, and the linen of his shirt sleeves is still clean, untouched by the work because his movements are so contained, so precise. At the widest point of the sole, where the curve begins to tighten again and sweep around toward the toe, the apprentice pauses. He sets the hammer down on its leather pad, the iron head making a soft, definitive little sound as it settles, and he lifts his hands away from the bench for a moment. He rolls his shoulders once, a small movement that shifts the blades without any audible crack, and he flexes his fingers, spreading them wide and then curling them loosely, encouraging the blood to move through the small muscles that have been gripping the hammer. The pause is not long. It lasts for perhaps 6 or 7 slow breaths, time enough for his gaze to travel along the row of nails he has set, counting them without numbers, simply seeing their progression as a whole. The iron heads form a dashed line against the pale leather, a line that is not perfectly straight, but follows the organic outline of the sole, a shape that has been determined by the foot it will serve and not by any ruler. Each head is a tiny faceted point of dark grey, and together they create a boundary that seems to define the edge of the boot, giving it a visual weight it lacked when the sole was bare. He picks up the hammer again, and the work resumes. The next section of the row passes around the toe, a tight sweeping curve that demands the greatest care and spacing. Here, the sole leather is thinner, tapering to meet the upper, and the nails must be placed close to the edge without breaking through the side wall. The apprentice slows his rhythm, allowing a full 2 breaths between each nail, and he angles the shaft of each hobnail very slightly inward, so that the point will travel through the thickest part of the leather and not emerge through the side. This angling is so subtle that you cannot see it. You can only infer it from the way his wrist rotates a fraction of a degree before the first tap, presenting the hammer face to the nail head at a tiny, specific cant. The sound here is lighter, a thin, bright tick for the first tap, because the leather is less dense and the nail sinks easily, the shaft finding its path through the fibers with little resistance. The final seating tap arrives as a soft, crisp click, the pyramid head nestling into the surface without any complaint. After 10 or 12 nails around this tight arc, the apprentice reaches the center of the toe, the most forward point of the boot. He marks this place not with a special nail, but with the quiet completion of the turn, the row now beginning its return journey along the opposite side of the sole. He rotates the boot on the bench, a slow, careful swivel that keeps the sole facing upward, but changes the angle of his approach, and he settles the new section of the curve under his gaze. The row will now trace a mirror image of the one he has just completed, moving back along the other side toward the opposite heel waist, and the apprentice begins this return with the same calm, unvarying technique, selecting the first nail of the homeward leg, placing its point on the pencil line, and delivering the 3 soft strokes that secure it in the leather. The light in the workshop has continued its slow, patient brightening, and the grey of the window glass now holds a faint, warm undertone, a hint of the sun that has risen above the tenement roofs and is shining somewhere beyond the close, unable to reach this narrow slot of city, but strong enough to tint the cloud cover with a pale, diluted gold. The dust motes drift in this new light with a more visible clarity, their slow spirals catching the eye and drawing it away from the bench for a second, but the apprentice does not follow them. His attention remains on the leather, on the iron, on the small, repeating task that has now occupied him for over an hour, and the world outside the workshop might as well be a painted cloth for all the notice he gives it. The sound of his hammer continues, a soft, precise percussion that weaves through the other sounds of the close, without disturbing them. From somewhere above the workshop, through the thick stone walls, comes the faint, rhythmic creak of a spinning wheel, a sound as steady and repetitive as the hammer itself, and the two rhythms exist side by side, without conflict, two different timekeepers marking the same slow morning. The spinning wheel creaks on its downstroke and whispers on its upstroke, a two-note pattern that repeats every second or two, and the apprentice's hammer punctuates the quieter moments of that pattern, fitting into the gaps like a stone settling into a dry wall. Neither the spinner nor the cobbler is aware of this duet. They each work in their separate pools of concentration, but the close itself holds their sounds together in a single, gentle fabric of industry. A fabric that has been woven every working day for centuries. The apprentice now reaches the long, relatively straight section that runs along the opposite side of the sole, and here the work takes on a quality of pure repetition that is its own form of rest. The curve is shallow, the spacing is established, and the pencil line guides his hand without any need for active thought. His body has learned the rhythm so completely that the process seems to happen of its own accord, the hand reaching for a nail, the fingers placing it, the hammer rising and falling, the slight pause, the next nail, the next, the next. This is the heart of the task, the long level plateau where time ceases to be measured in minutes and becomes instead a slow, continuous flow marked only by the accumulation of iron heads in the leather. The apprentice is not bored, because boredom requires a desire for something else, and there is nothing else that he wishes to be doing, no other place that calls to him. He is not excited, because excitement requires an anticipation of change, and this task involves no change, only the steady incremental extension of a row of nails along a predetermined path. He is simply present, his mind settled into the work like water settling into a bowl, its surface still and clear. The outer row now extends along the entire perimeter of the sole, except for the last few inches near the heel, and the apprentice can see the end of this phase of the work approaching. He does not quicken his pace. If anything, he slows it, allowing each of the final nails its full measure of attention, because the last nails are no less important than the first, and a mistake made at the end would undo the patient labor of the morning. He places the nails around the remaining curve of the heel waist with the same careful three-tap sequence, the same checking of the angle, the same quiet regard for the emerging pattern. The iron heads now form a complete ring, a dark, dotted oval that traces the outline of the sole, and the apprentice sets the final nail into its place with a soft, definitive thock that sounds no different from any of the others, but carries in its timing a sense of closure. He sets the hammer down and leans back on the stool, his spine straightening, his hands coming to rest on his thighs. For a long moment, he simply looks at the work he has done, his gaze traveling slowly along the entire perimeter of the sole, checking the evenness of the spacing, the flushness of the heads, the clean, uninterrupted flow of the curve. The ring of hobnails stands as a quiet achievement, a thing that was not there an hour and a half ago and is now complete, a transformation of the blank leather into a prepared surface, ready for the next phase of the work. The nail heads catch the light in 100 tiny glints, their dark facets gleaming like the backs of small polished beetles, and the pale leather around them seems softer by contrast, its grain more visible now that it has been framed by the iron border. The apprentice breathes out, a slow, even exhale that carries no particular emotion, only the gentle release of sustained focus. He wipes his fingers on the scrap of cloth, removing the fine dark dust of the forged scale, and he rubs the cloth over the heads of the nails once more, burnishing them to an even, subdued luster. Then he lifts the boot from the bench, holds it at arm's length, and turns it slowly in the grey light, seeing the sole from every angle, ensuring that no nail has been missed, that no gap has been left, that the work is true. Satisfied, he sets the boot aside on the shelf below the bench, its mate waiting there with its own blank, unnailed sole, and he picks up the second boot, resting it on the bench with the sole facing upward, a new field of pale leather ready for the same slow transformation. The morning is not yet half done, and the second outer row awaits. The apprentice reaches for the hobnail box, his hand finding it by touch, and he selects the first nail of the new boot with the same deliberate care that he brought to the first nail of the day. The hammer lifts, the guiding tap sounds, and the slow, patient rhythm begins again, exactly as before, a quiet, unbroken line of small, precise sounds that will continue through the morning and into the afternoon, marking the passage of the ordinary day in iron and leather. Mid-morning arrives in the close without announcement, a slow, imperceptible transition that you notice only after it has already occurred. The light that falls through the small workshop window has lost its early grey coolness and taken on a faint, diluted warmth, the colour of well-watered milk, and the shadows that earlier lay flat and diffuse against the floor now carry a soft edge, a subtle definition that gives the room a little more depth. The air has warmed by a degree or two, enough that the scent of tallow and old wood becomes slightly more present, the molecules moving more freely in the gentle heat, and the stones of the walls, which held the night's chill through the first hours of the day, have begun to release their coolness in a slow, invisible exhalation that you sense against your cheeks rather than feel directly. The apprentice continues his work on the second boot, his rhythm unchanged, despite the shifting light. The outer row of hobnails has advanced from the heel waist along one side of the sole, a procession of small iron stars that mirrors exactly the pattern he laid on the first boot, and his hand moves with the same unhurried precision that marked the earliest taps of the morning. The hammer rises and falls in its three-beat phrase, the tick and thock, merging with the heavier silence of the workshop, and the sound has become so much a part of the room's atmosphere that you would notice its absence more sharply than its presence, a gap in the texture of the quiet rather than an addition to it. Outside the workshop door, in the narrow passage of the close, the morning has begun its own quiet routine. You hear the uneven footsteps of someone walking down the cobbled slope, the pace slow and slightly laboured, suggesting a burden carried in both arms, and through the thick glass of the window you glimpse a shadow that passes across the light, a dark shape that moves without hurry, its outline blurred by the bubbled panes. The footsteps pause, and you hear a soft, huffing breath, the sound of a person shifting weight, and then a door closes somewhere further down the close with a low, woody thump that echoes briefly between the stone walls before the silence absorbs it. The footsteps do not resume, and you understand that the person has reached their destination, a neighbour returning from the high street with a basket or a pail, their small journey complete. A moment later, a woman passes the workshop door carrying a basket of damp linen. You see her through the open gap of the doorway, a figure in a plain wool dress of dark, indeterminate colour, her hair covered by a linen cap that has been washed so often it has the same soft oatmeal hue as the apprentice's shirt. The basket is large and woven of pale willow withies that creak gently with each of her steps, a small, rhythmic sound like the mast of a boat rocking in a calm harbour, and the linen inside has been folded into neat, compact squares that steam very faintly in the cool air, releasing a clean, mineral scent that drifts into the workshop and mingles with the tallow and leather. She does not look into the workshop as she passes, and the apprentice does not look up from his bench, each of them absorbed in their separate tasks, their paths crossing without any need for acknowledgement. Her footsteps continue up the slope toward the high street, the creak of the basket fading by degrees, until it merges with the general murmur of the city above, and then she is gone, leaving only the faint, clean smell of washed cloth as evidence of her passing. The apprentice pauses in his hammering, not because of the woman or the basket, but because he has reached a section of the sole where the leather grain is particularly dense, a patch of compressed fibre that resists the entry of the nail. He turns the boot slightly on the bench, angling it so that the light from the window falls more directly on the spot, and he leans close to examine the surface, his eyes narrowing by the smallest degree. The leather here shows a tight, swirling grain pattern, a knot of fibres that has been pressed into a hard, dark node, and he runs his thumb over it to test its give, finding it unyielding. He selects a hobnail with particular care, choosing one whose shaft is slightly sharper than the others, the cut end showing a clean, square face without any burr, and he places its point at the centre of the dense patch with the same gentle, vertical precision as always. The first tap sets the point, The second drives it deeper with a slightly increased resistance that he meets without forcing, and the third tap delivers the head flush. But the sound is different here. A compact, dense tock rather than the usual thock, the leather absorbing the vibration more quickly and releasing it as a shorter, drier note. He checks the nail head with his thumb, finds it secure, and moves on to the next. The small challenge met and resolved without any change in his expression or his pace. A water carrier now enters the close from the high street, his presence announced by the slosh and trickle of the buckets that hang from the yoke across his shoulders. You hear the water moving inside the wooden pails, a heavy, liquid sound that rises and falls with his gait, and the iron fittings of the yoke creak with a steady, rhythmic complaint, a note that repeats every second step. He stops at the head of the close, near the first doorway, and you hear the creak of the yoke as he lowers one bucket to the ground, then the faint splash of a ladle, then the low murmur of a voice exchanging a few calm words with someone inside the house. The words are too soft to distinguish, only the cadence of courteous transaction reaching your ears, a question and an answer. A thank you, the clink of a coin or a token dropped into a pocket. He lifts the bucket again, the water sloshing heavily, and carries on down the close, his steps slow and deliberate on the uneven cobbles, the yoke creaking in its patient rhythmic way, until he passes beyond the bend and the sounds fade into the deeper quiet of the lower passage. During this small interruption, the apprentice has placed 3 more hobnails, his rhythm absorbing the outside sounds without any sign that he has heard them. His world is the boot, the bench, the small arc of the hammer, and the extraneous noises of the close are no more distracting to him than the dust motes drifting through the light, present but irrelevant, a gentle background texture that does not intrude upon his attention. The hammering continues, the 3-beat phrase repeating itself with only the tiniest variations in tempo, and the row of nails extends along the side of the sole, a quiet, incremental expansion of the pattern. The light in the workshop has now brightened enough to reveal details that were hidden in the early dimness. On the far wall, above the shelf of clay pots, a single cobweb hangs in the corner where 2 beams meet, its silk strands so fine they are visible only because they catch the light at a certain angle, appearing as a faint silvery tracery that trembles in the slow circulation of the air. The cobweb is old and abandoned, its maker long gone, and a few tiny particles of dust have settled on its threads, giving it a slightly heavier appearance near the center where the spiral tightens. Below the cobweb, the surface of the wall shows the faint, ghostly outlines of previous shelves that were removed and replaced at some point in the distant past, their former positions marked by rows of dark nail holes and a subtle change in the color of the stone, a slightly lighter rectangle where the wood once shielded the wall from smoke and dust. These traces of the workshop's earlier arrangements are unnoticed by the apprentice, who has known them all his life and sees them as part of the room's unchanging nature, not as history, but simply as the way things have always been. On the bench itself, the oil lamp that sits at the back corner has burned low. The apprentice notices this during a pause between nails, his gaze lifting from the sole and catching the weak yellow flicker of the flame, and he sets the hammer down to attend to it. The lamp is a simple thing, a small brass reservoir filled with oil, its wick a twisted cord of cotton that rises through a narrow tube and burns with a steady, teardrop-shaped flame that gives off a faint, warm scent of burning fat, a smell that blends so perfectly with the tallow and leather that it is almost invisible. The wick has become charred at its tip, a small dark burr of carbon that dims the light, and the apprentice pinches this away with his fingernails, extinguishing the flame for a moment, then relights it with a spark from a steel and flint that sit in a small dish beside the lamp. The new flame catches cleanly, burning brighter and steadier than before, its yellow glow adding a small pocket of warmth to the grey light from the window, and the apprentice watches it for a second to ensure it is taken properly before returning his attention to the boot. The relighting of the lamp, performed without haste or ceremony, marks a small passage of time, a quiet acknowledgement that the morning is advancing and that the darkness of the room's corners will soon begin its slow retreat toward the walls. The flame will burn all day, even when the window light reaches its peak, because the narrow close never catches the direct sun, and the workshop lives in a perpetual twilight that requires the small, constant assistance of the oil lamp to keep the work visible in its finer details. The lamp has burned on this bench through thousands of working days, its brass reservoir refilled each morning, its wick trimmed as needed, a small faithful companion to the hammer and the awl. The apprentice picks up the hammer and resumes the outer row. The curve of the sole now approaches the toe of the second boot, and the nails must be angled with the same careful inward cant that he used on the first boot, a slight rotation of the wrist that guides the shaft through the thin edge leather without breaking the surface. His movements are a mirror of the earlier work, so precisely similar that an observer might think they were watching the same sequence repeated in a loop. Yet there are tiny differences if you look closely. The way his left thumb holds the boot a fraction differently, the angle of his head, the slightly deeper shadow under his brow. As the light shifts, the work is the same, but the moment is new, and the apprentice remains present in it, not drifting into memory or anticipation, simply placing one nail after another with the same quiet regard. The sounds of the close continue their slow, gentle pattern outside the door. Footsteps pass at intervals, some firm and brisk on the cobbles, others slow and shuffling, and each set of footsteps has its own distinctive rhythm, its own weight, its own brief story that begins and ends in the space of a few seconds. A child runs past, the steps light and quick. A patter of small leather soles on stone, followed a moment later by a slower, heavier tread that must belong to the child's parent or minder. A pace that is not hurrying but steady, carrying the calm authority of an adult who knows the child has gone only a little way ahead. Their sounds fade up toward the high street, and the close returns to its quiet state, the stone walls holding the memory of their passing for no longer than an echo, which in this narrow space is no echo at all, but a swift silencing. The apprentice pauses again, this time to wipe the fine dark dust from his fingers. He uses the scrap of cloth, rubbing each fingertip in turn. Then the cloth goes back to its place on the bench. He rotates the boot, checks the spacing of the nails he has set, and finds it correct. The outer row is now 3/4 complete. The ring of iron heads tracing the toe curve and beginning the return journey along the other side, and the pale leather has been transformed by the dark dotted line into something that looks purposeful, ready, a sole that will grip the wet cobbles and hold firm against the wear of daily walking. The apprentice does not admire his work in any obvious way, but there is a slight, almost imperceptible settling of his shoulders as he regards the boot. A minute relaxation that suggests something like satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement that the task is proceeding as it should. You notice now that the spinning wheel above has fallen silent. It stopped at some point in the last quarter of an hour, its creak and whisper fading from the background without any announcement, and the close feels slightly different in its absence, a little more hollow, a little more still. The silence that remains is not empty, but rearranged, the layers of sound shifting to accommodate the loss, and now you can hear, very faintly, the distant bell of a clock striking the hour from somewhere in the high street. A thin, silvery chime that reaches the close through a dozen stone walls, its clarity muffled and softened until it is barely more than a suggestion of sound. A ghost of a bell that might have been imagined. The chime counts 11 strokes, each one a delicate fading note, and then the silence returns fuller than before. The hour means nothing to the apprentice, whose day is measured not in clock strokes, but in nails placed and rows completed. He continues the outer row, the hammer rising and falling, the 3-beat phrase repeating, the iron heads accumulating one by one. The second boot will be finished soon, its outer ring complete, and then the work will move to the inner nails, the smaller cluster that will reinforce the heel and give the workman a firm purchase on the steep, cobbled streets. But that is still ahead, and the apprentice does not anticipate it, remaining instead in the present moment of each individual nail, each small, precise tap that joins iron to leather, each calm breath that separates one action from the next. The morning light holds steady, the lamp burns quietly, and the close settles into the long, slow plateau of the working day. The apprentice places the first finished boot on the shelf below the bench, setting it down with the sole upward, so that the ring of hobnails catches the lamplight in a dark constellation of tiny, faceted gleams. The second boot rests before him on the bench, its sole a blank field of pale, unmarked leather, and the time has come to prepare this surface before the nails can be driven. He reaches not for the hammer nor the nail box, but for the small clay pot of tallow that sits among the row of vessels on the shelf above the bench, his hand finding it by memory, the fingers closing around its rough, unglazed surface with the same easy familiarity that a cook might reach for a salt cellar in a well-known kitchen. The tallow pot is a plain, sturdy thing shaped by a potter whose name was forgotten 100 years ago, its walls uneven and slightly warped from the wheel, bearing the faint spiral ridges of the thrower's thumbs. The clay has fired to a deep, warm brown, the color of roasted chestnut shells, and in places a lighter, sandier shade shows through where the surface has been rubbed smooth by years of handling. The pot is no larger than a small teacup, and it sits comfortably in the palm, its base fitting into the hollow of the hand while the fingers wrap around its sides. A wooden lid, simple and round, plugs the top, and this lid has shrunk slightly with age, so that it fits with a tiny dry looseness, a fractional give that produces a soft, woody sound when it is removed, a sound like a very small cork drawn from a bottle. The apprentice sets the lid aside on the bench, its underside dark and glossy with the residue of countless dippings, and he looks into the pot. Inside, the tallow is a pale, cloudy substance, the color of old ivory or the flesh of a blanched almond, and its surface is not smooth but slightly granular, a fine crystalline texture that catches the light in a soft matte scatter. It has set into a shallow dome that slopes down toward the edges of the pot, the result of being melted and cooled many times, each cycle leaving a faint ring mark on the inner wall, a record of the tallow's slow, patient life in the workshop. The scent that rises from the pot is mild and clean, a faint, fatty sweetness that carries no rancor or sharpness, a smell that belongs to the same family as plain soap or a newly trimmed candle wick. It is not a scent you would notice in passing, but held close like this, it fills the small space around the bench with a quiet, comforting presence, a scent of care and preparation. The apprentice dips the tip of his forefinger into the pot, pressing it gently into the surface of the tallow. The substance yields under the warmth of his skin, the granular crust softening and becoming translucent where it touches him, and he rotates his finger in a small, slow circle, gathering a thin, even coating of the fat on his fingertip. The tallow melts at the temperature of the body, and as he withdraws his finger, the coating is already beginning to turn from opaque to clear, a thin, glossy film that makes his skin shine faintly in the lamplight. He rubs his thumb against his forefinger, spreading the tallow between them, feeling its slick, smooth texture, a texture that is not oily or greasy, but simply soft, a gentle lubrication that reduces friction between the ridges of his fingerprints. He transfers a small amount of the tallow to the leather sole, dabbing it onto the center of the pale surface in a series of small, evenly spaced dots, like the points of a constellation not yet connected by lines. The tallow sits on the leather in tiny, translucent beads, each one no larger than the lentil, and it begins immediately to soften the fibers beneath it, the leather darkening by a shade where the fat touches. The apprentice sets the pot aside, the wooden lid replaced with a soft press of his thumb, and he takes up a scrap of clean cloth that has been folded and kept for this very purpose. A square of soft, worn linen that has been washed so many times its weave is visible as a fine, loose grid, its edges frayed into a gentle fringe. With the cloth wrapped around his first two fingers, he begins to spread the tallow across the sole. The motion is a slow, circular rubbing, the cloth moving in small, overlapping spirals that start at the center and work outward toward the edges, carrying the tallow toward the edges, carrying the tallow with them. The fat sinks into the leather as the warmth of his hand, transmitted through the cloth, helps it to penetrate the dense fibers, and the pale surface darkens by degrees, taking on a rich, waxy translucence that reminds you of a parchment held before a candle flame. The grain of the leather, which before was a faint dry pattern, now becomes more visible, the fine lines of the hide's natural structure emerging as a subtle organic tracery, like the watershed of a gently sloping field seen from a distance. The apprentice works the cloth around the edge of the sole with particular care, pressing the tallow into the tight corner where the sole meets the welt, a seam that must be nourished so that the stitching remains supple and the leather does not crack along the line of the join. He uses the tip of his cloth-wrapped finger to trace this boundary, a slow, deliberate pass that follows the entire perimeter, and the leather here drinks the tallow eagerly, darkening to a deep brownish grey that stands out against the still pale upper. The scent of the tallow, warmed by the friction, rises more strongly now, filling the workshop with its soft, fatty presence, and it mingles with the ever-present smell of old wood and leather and lamp oil, adding a new note that is both clean and ancient. When the entire sole has been coated, the apprentice pauses and looks at his work, tilting the boot so that the light from the window slides across the surface, revealing any spots that remain dry. He finds a small patch near the toe, a pale, unglossed oval where the tallow has not reached, and he dabs a fresh dot of fat onto it, working it in with the same slow circular motion until it blends with the rest. Then he sets the cloth down and lets the boot rest on the bench, the sole facing up, the tallow slowly settling into the leather fibers, softening them, preparing them to receive the iron shafts without splitting or cracking. This preparation is not a step that can be rushed. The leather must absorb the tallow thoroughly before the nails are driven, or the fibers will tear rather than part, and the holding power of the hobnails will be compromised. The apprentice knows this not as a lesson learned from a book, but as a bodily understanding, a knowledge that lives in his hands and his eyes, passed down through the quiet gestures of the master cobbler who taught him, who was himself taught by another in a long, unbroken chain of hands reaching back through the centuries of the close. He waits, his hands resting on his thighs, his breathing slow and even, and the workshop holds its silence around him, the tallow pot sitting quietly on the shelf, the cloth draped over the edge of the bench, the lamplight steady and small. During this waiting, the apprentice turns to the first boot, lifting it from the shelf below and setting it on the bench beside its mate. He runs his thumb over the heads of the hobnails he has already set, feeling their evenness, their flushness, and he finds them satisfactory. The iron is cool and smooth under his touch, the tiny pyramid heads a texture like very fine sandpaper, and the leather around them has begun to take on the first hints of the patina that will develop over the life of the boot, a darkening around each nail head where the tallow from the leather and the iron from the nail will react together in a slow, invisible chemistry. He sets the first boot aside again and returns his attention to the second, testing the surface of the sole with the ball of his thumb to see if the tallow has been absorbed. The leather feels different now, less dry and papery, more supple and dense, its surface having taken on a slight waxy resistance that will ease the passage of the nail shafts. The color has settled to an even, warm tan, darker than before, but not so dark as the finished sole of the first boot, and the grain lines stand out clearly, a quiet map of the animal's life written in the hide. The apprentice judges that the tallow has been absorbed sufficiently, and he reaches once more for the hobnail box, drawing it closer to him on the bench with a gentle sliding push. The nails inside shift with a faint, dry rustle, a sound like very small pebbles tumbling in a tin cup, and the dark, jumbled mass of iron pyramids waits for his hand. He selects the first nail of this new phase, turning it over in his fingers with the same careful attention that he brought to the very first nail of the morning, feeling its coolness, its slight roughness, its tiny, specific geometry. He places its point on the sole at the heel waist, exactly where the outer row began on the first boot, and he aligns it with the faint silvery pencil line that he has already drawn on this second sole, a guide that mirrors the first in every particular. The hammer comes to his hand, the ash handle settling into his palm, and the first soft, guiding tap sounds through the workshop, a small tick that marks the beginning of the second outer row. The tallow does its quiet work. The nail point slips into the leather with a slightly easier, smoother penetration, the fibers parting around the square shaft with less resistance than before, and the sound of the tap is a shade softer, a little less sharp, cushioned by the fat that has filled the spaces in the hide. The apprentice does not remark on this difference, though he feels it through the hammer handle, a subtle change in the feedback that his hand interprets without conscious thought. He simply adjusts the force of his second tap by an infinitesimal amount, compensating for the reduced resistance, and the nail sinks to half its depth with a clean, frictionless glide. The third tap seats the head flush, the pyramid nestling into the tallowed leather with a small, satisfied thock, and the first iron star of the second boot sits securely in its place, a dark point on the pale, waxy field. The work resumes its slow, patient rhythm. The apprentice moves along the pencil line, placing nail after nail, each one receiving the 3-tap sequence with the same careful attention to angle, spacing, and depth. The tallow continues to ease the passage of the iron, and the sound of the hammering is now a series of slightly muffled cushion notes. The sharp tick of the morning replaced by a softer, duller tap that blends even more smoothly with the background silence. The apprentice works his way around the curve of the heel waist, his hand steady, his breathing slow, and the row extends itself with the same inevitable, quiet progress that marked the first boot. A progress that is not measured in minutes, but in nails. As he works, the smell of the tallow continues to rise from the leather, and now it is joined by a faint metallic scent from the iron nails. A cool, clean smell, like a wrought nail, held in a closed palm on a winter day. The two scents combine in the still air of the workshop, and together they create a fragrance that is the essence of this particular task. A smell that the apprentice would recognize anywhere but never thinks about, a background note in the larger composition of his working life. The lamplight flickers once, a tiny, almost imperceptible waver caused by a draft that has found its way through the door, and the flame steadies again, burning with its quiet teardrop shape, adding its own faint warm scent of burnt oil to the mixture. The apprentice reaches the long side of the sole, and here, in the straight section beneath the ball of the foot, the work settles into its deepest rhythm, the repetition becoming a form of stillness. A quiet, continuous state rather than a series of discrete actions. The nails accumulate, the row grows, and the boot transforms under his hands in a slow, patient way that seems to happen almost of its own accord, the iron heads appearing one by one as if they were emerging from the leather rather than being driven into it. The morning continues outside the workshop, the close going about its slow business, and inside, the apprentice continues his task. The tallow pot returned to its shelf, the cloth folded on the bench, the hammer rising and falling in its small measured arc, and the second boot nearing its completion, nail by quiet nail. The morning has passed without any announcement, the grey light from the small window shifting from a cool, milky pallor to a flat, even tone that holds no trace of the early chill. The workshop rests in the deep quiet of the afternoon hour, that slow, suspended time when the city outside seems to draw a long, unhurried breath and hold it. You stand near the bench, close enough to see the fine, pale dust that has settled on the apprentice's apron, and you find that your attention turns naturally from the visual to the audible, from the sight of the hammer rising and falling, to the sound it makes and to all the other sounds that weave through the stillness around it. The room has become a vessel for these gentle noises, and your ears, now tuned to the quiet, begin to pick them out one by one, as a person might pick out the individual threads in a length of plain cloth. The hammer continues its work on the second boot, the outer row nearly complete, and its sound is so familiar by now that it feels less like an event and more like a part of the silence itself. You hear it as a soft, cushioned tap, the tallowed leather absorbing much of the sharpness, so that each stroke is a small, round note that occupies the air for only a moment before the quiet reclaims it. The rhythm is steady, but not metronomic. The apprentice takes a slightly longer pause every 5 or 6 nails, a pause that lasts no more than 2 quiet breaths, and in that pause the hammer rests on its leather pad, and the workshop fills with a different quality of stillness, a stillness that seems to listen alongside you. It is during one of these pauses that you first notice the humming of the spinning wheel. The sound comes from somewhere above the workshop, perhaps 2 stories up, transmitted through the stone walls and the heavy timber joists as a faint, continuous vibration. It is a low, steady note, not so much a hum as a soft, whirring thrum that rises and falls by the tiniest increments, as the spinner's foot rocks the treadle with unconscious variation. The tone is a warm, woody buzz, and it carries within it a secondary sound, a very faint, high whisper that might be the twist of the wool passing through the flyer, a sound so fine it is almost imagined. The spinning wheel has been at its work for the better part of an hour, but only now, in this pause between nails, does it become distinct, its presence rising out of the background as a star becomes visible when the sky darkens just enough. The apprentice sets the next nail on the sole, and the hammer lifts again, delivering the first guiding tap, a sound that seems to answer the spinning wheel's note. 2 quiet industrial voices exchanging a calm greeting across the levels of the tenement. The tick of the hammer and the hum of the wheel, occupy different registers, and they do not clash but simply coexist, each sound moving through its own space and time, independent, yet part of the same slow fabric of the afternoon. You let your eyes rest on the grey rectangle of the window while the hammer completes its 3-beat phrase, and you notice that the light outside has become marginally brighter, the cloud cover perhaps thinning a little, though still no direct sun reaches the close. The thin, diffuse brightness makes the workshop seem slightly more open, the corners a little less deep, and the dust motes that drift above the bench are now clearly visible, tiny specks of leather and wood fibre that spin in the slow, warm currents rising from the oil lamp. The hammering pauses again as the apprentice leans forward to inspect the spot where the last nail has been driven. A very small curl of leather has been pushed up by the shaft, a delicate pale ring no thicker than a shaving from a wood plane, and it stands proud against the dark, tallowed surface. He pinches it between his thumb and the side of his forefinger, drawing it away with a single steady pull that makes a sound so faint you cannot be certain you heard it. A tiny, fibrous whisper that is gone before your ear can fully catch it. He brushes the curled fragment from his apron, and it drifts to the flagstone floor, joining the other small fragments that have accumulated there through the day. Then, with his hands still for a moment, the workshop falls into a silence that is deeper than the pauses before, and it is in this silence that the other sounds of the close come forward to meet you. From the high street above, an iron bracket creaks as a signboard swings in a slow, lazy arc, moved by a draught so gentle it would not stir a feather on the ground. The creak is a low, rusty note, a single, thin complaint of metal on metal that lasts for perhaps a second and then fades, leaving behind a faint, residual vibration that you feel in the stone beneath your feet rather than hear. The signboard is old, its ironwork darkened by decades of rain, and its creak is a sound that belongs to the close as much as the cobblestones and the damp wool. A sound that has been part of this place since long before the apprentice was born. A moment later, the board swings again, or perhaps it is another board further along the street, and this time the creak is slightly higher in pitch, a short, dry squeak that cuts off abruptly as the breeze dies. Voices now drift down from the close mouth. 2 women walking slowly down the slope, their words indistinct, but their tones calm and unhurried. You cannot make out what they are saying, only the gentle rise and fall of their speech, the way one voice holds a note for a little longer before the other replies with a low, soft murmur. Their footsteps are slow, the sound of leather soles on worn cobblestones blending with their voices. A quiet, rhythmic scuff that passes in front of the workshop doorway, and then continues down toward the bend, growing fainter by degrees. One of the women laughs, a small, brief sound that is more a release of breath than a full laugh, and then their voices merge into the general murmur that rises from the lower close, a murmur that is made of many small sounds too distant to separate. The closing of a door, the distant clink of a pail, a child calling out and being answered. Inside the workshop, the apprentice has not looked up. His attention remains on the boot, on the pencil line and the row of nail heads, and his hand has already selected the next hobnail, his fingers closing around it with the same calm, searching pressure as always. The hammer lifts for the first guiding tap, and the tick of the nail point entering the tallowed leather cuts through the murmur like a needle passing through a soft, thick fabric. This sound is clearer now because the voices have moved away, and the spinning wheel, having reached some natural pause in the spinner's work, has fallen silent for a moment, its hum replaced by a deep, almost cavernous quiet. The apprentice places the second tap, then the third, and the hobnail sinks home with a soft, definitive thok that seems to anchor the quiet back in place, as if the sound itself had been the missing piece that the silence required. You become aware now of a sound that has been present all along, a sound so constant and so low that it has been hiding beneath the other sounds unnoticed. It is the very faint, distant rush of water, a sound that comes from the open channel of the central gutter as it carries a slow, steady trickle of dishwater and pump spillage down the slope of the close toward the cowgate. The water moves with a hushed, continuous hiss, a sound like a person breathing very softly through slightly parted lips, and it is punctuated at irregular intervals by the light, musical drip of a single drop falling from a spout somewhere near the top of the close. The drip lands on a stone with a small, bright plink that echoes briefly between the walls, a clean, high note that stands out against the low hiss of the running water like a star against a dark sky. The apprentice pays no attention to this drip. It has been part of his working day for so long that it has ceased to be a separate sound and become instead a part of the quiet itself, a tiny, liquid punctuation mark in the long sentence of the afternoon. The hammering pauses again, and the apprentice reaches for the scrap of cloth to wipe a small smear of tallow from his palm where the fat has warmed and spread. The cloth makes a faint, dry sound as he rubs it across his skin, a soft brushing friction that is over in a moment, and he sets it aside before taking up a new nail. In this pause, you hear the spinning wheel resume its humming from above, the treadle creaking once as the spinner settles back into the rhythm, and the low, woody buzz fills the space again, steady and reassuring. The hum seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that travels through the stone and the timber, vibrating the very air, and it is joined now by another sound, a very faint, rhythmic tapping that might be a weaver's shuttle or a bodkin being driven through a piece of heavy cloth in another workshop further down the close. This tapping is slower than the cobbler's hammer, a single, measured beat that repeats every few seconds, and it has a flatter, duller tone, as if the tool being used is made of wood rather than iron. The two rhythms, the hammer and the distant tap, fall into an accidental, shifting pattern, sometimes coinciding, sometimes drifting apart, a quiet, unconscious duet that no one conducts and no one hears except you, standing here in the cool dimness with your breath slow and your shoulders heavy. The apprentice moves on to the final section of the outer row, the curve that sweeps around the toe of the second boot, and here the sound of the hammer changes slightly. The leather is thinner near the edge, and the tallow has penetrated it more deeply, so that the nail shafts sink with an easier, smoother penetration. The resulting tap is a little lighter, a little shorter, a soft, bright tink rather than a thock, and the sounds seem to vanish more quickly into the air, leaving no resonance. The apprentice adjusts his grip on the hammer handle by a fraction, his fingers sliding down the ash wood a quarter of an inch to give himself more control, and the taps become even softer, more precise, each one a tiny focus note that drives the nail head flush without disturbing the leather around it. The pattern of iron heads now traces the tight arc of the toe, and the sound of each tap is followed by a very brief silence in which you can hear the water drip again, the spinning wheel hum, the distant tap of the other workshop, all layered together in a calm, gentle chorus. A new sound enters the close as a horse and cart pass along the high street far above. The iron-shod wheels grind against the stone sets with a low, continuous rumble that starts as a distant vibration and grows slightly louder as the cart passes the close mouth, only to fade again into the distance. The sound is a deep, earthy grumble, the sound of great weight moving slowly, and it overpowers the other sounds for a few seconds, submerging the drip of water and the hum of the spinning wheel beneath its broad, rolling presence. The apprentice continues his hammering through the rumble, the small ticks of the nails cutting through the lower frequency of the cartwheels like a bird's call cutting through a low wind, and then the cart passes on, the rumble fading by degrees until the other sounds return, one by one, in the cart's wake. First the water drip returns, the small, bright plink sounding somehow clearer after the deep noise. Then the spinning wheel hums back into audibility. Then the distant tapping resumes its slow, patient beat. The apprentice finishes the outer row of the second boot. He sets the hammer down on its leather rest with a small, definitive sound that you have come to recognize as the sign of a phase completed. And he leans back on the stool, his spine straightening, his hands coming to rest on his thighs. The boot sits on the bench before him, its sole now ringed with the same dark, dotted oval of iron heads that marks the first boot, and the two soles are mirrors of each other, each nail placed in its precise, corresponding position. The apprentice takes a long, slow breath, and you find yourself breathing with him, your chest rising and falling in the same unhurried rhythm, the quiet of the workshop pressing gently on your ears. He does not move to begin the next task immediately. Instead, he sits still, his head tilted slightly to one side, and it seems to you that he is listening, as you are listening, to the layered sounds of the afternoon. The spinning wheel hums its woody note. The water drips and hisses in the gutter, the distant shuttle or bodkin taps its slow, flat beat, and somewhere very far away, a dog barks once, a single, low woof that is swallowed by the stone walls before it can echo. The apprentice reaches down to the shelf below the bench and lifts the first boot, bringing it up beside its freshly nailed mate. He turns both boots so that their soles face upward side by side, and he runs his thumb across the heads of the nails on the old boot, then across the heads of the new, comparing the texture, the evenness, the depth. A small curl of leather has been pushed up on the first boot near the heel, one that he missed earlier, and he removes it now with the same careful pinch of his thumb and forefinger, the tiny fibrous whisper sounding once more. He brushes the curl from his apron, and the scrap of leather joins the others on the floor. A small, pale crescent that will be swept away at the end of the day. Then he picks up the hammer again, and the work continues, moving now to the inner heel cluster, a new set of nails that will reinforce the center of the heel and give the workman a firm, sure footing on the steep cobbles. The sound of the hammer shifts again as the apprentice begins this inner work. The nails for the heel cluster are slightly shorter and thicker than the outer hobnails, their shafts square and stout, and they require a firmer, more deliberate blow to drive them into the dense, many-layered leather of the heel. The sound is a heavier tock, a duller, deeper note that seems to resonate in the bench for a fraction of a second longer than the outer nails did, and the apprentice's hand moves with a little more weight behind each stroke, though still slow and controlled. The rhythm changes too. Because the nails are shorter, they require only 2 taps in some cases, the guiding tap and the driving tap combined into a single, smooth motion, so that the phrase becomes a 2-beat tick-tock rather than a 3-beat tick-tock. This new rhythm blends with the old, a variation on the same quiet theme, and the afternoon continues its slow, patient unfurling, the sounds of the close weaving around the hammer in a calm, indifferent counterpoint. The spinning wheel stops again, and in its absence you notice a new sound, a very faint, high ringing that might be the heated air rising from the oil lamp's chimney, or the distant chime of a clock striking the quarter hour somewhere in the city. The sound is thin and silvery, a thread of brightness against the deep stone-colored quiet, and it lasts for only a few seconds before fading, leaving behind the steady hiss of the gutter water and the tock of the heel nails. The apprentice does not pause for it. His hammer continues its slow, measured work, the heel cluster growing nail by nail, a small constellation of iron heads that will bear the workman's weight on 1,000 wet mornings just like this one. Mornings that are still to come, but will arrive in their own slow time, as unhurried and inevitable as the drip of water from the spout and the deep, patient quiet of the close at rest. The last of the inner heel nails sinks into the dense leather with a low, solid tock that seems to travel through the bench and into the flagstones, a sound that carries a sense of finality, not because it is louder than the others, but because it is the concluding stroke in a long, slow sequence. The apprentice sets the hammer down on its leather rest and does not pick it up again, his hand releasing the ash handle with a gentle, deliberate opening of the fingers, as if letting go of a trusted companion at the end of a shared journey. Both boots now sit on the bench before him, their soles facing upward, the pale leather transformed by the dark, precise geometry of iron heads that cover the outer perimeter and fill the central block of each heel. The work of the hammer is complete, and the quiet that follows seems fuller than any quiet that has come before, a deep, settling stillness that wraps around the finished boots like a held breath. You step a little closer, your gaze falling on the soles with the same patient attention that the apprentice has given them, and you see that the arrangement of hobnails is not merely a collection of individual fasteners, but a single, coherent pattern that has been laid down with the quiet discipline of long practice. The outer ring on each boot traces the outline of the sole with an even, flowing curve, the nail heads spaced so regularly that the eye moves along them without catching on any gap or crowding. Each head is a small faceted pyramid of dark grey iron, and the facets catch the lamplight and the window light together, creating a subtle, shifting sparkle that is not bright but subdued, a muted glitter like the surface of a rain-dampened cobblestone at dusk. The inner heel cluster forms a compact rectangle of smaller, shorter nails, their heads set flush with the surface but distinguishable by their slightly different shape, a more rounded dome-like top rather than a sharp pyramid, and they are arranged in 4 neat rows of 5, a grid that fills the center of the heel block with a dense, reinforcing field of iron. Between the outer ring and the inner cluster, the untouched leather forms a pale, unmarked pathway, a quiet moat of smooth hide that separates the two regions and gives the pattern a clear, balanced composition. The apprentice runs his thumb across the surface of the first boot, starting at the heel and moving slowly toward the toe, and the texture beneath his skin is a thing of many small sensations combined into one. The nail heads feel like a field of tiny rounded stones, each one a slight hard prominence against the softer leather, and the evenness of their height is such that his thumb glides across them without catching, as if he was stroking the surface of a very fine rasp. The leather between the nails has been compressed slightly by the driving of the shafts, and it has a subtle undulating quality, a gentle swell around each head that his thumb can detect, but his eye cannot see. He reaches the toe, turns the boot, and traces the pattern again from the other side, feeling for any nail that stands proud or sits too deep, and he finds none. The surface is as even as a cobbled street laid by a master pavior, each element set to the same plane, the whole thing a single, unified texture that will grip the wet stone and the packed mud with equal, uncomplaining reliability. He sets the first boot down and lifts the second, repeating the slow, investigative stroke of his thumb across the sole. The tallow that he worked into the leather earlier has now been fully absorbed, and the surface feels waxy and dense, the fibers softened but firm, the nails held securely in place by the natural grip of the hide, as much as by the barbs of the iron. His thumb finds a single nail near the toe that sits a hair's breadth lower than its neighbors, a minute depression that would make no difference to the wearer, but which his trained skin detects as a slight, soft dip in the topography. He selects the hammer once more, places the polished face against the low nail head, and gives a single, gentle tap. Not a driving stroke, but a subtle pressing nudge that lifts the nail by the smallest fraction, bringing it into line with the rest. He runs his thumb over the spot again, finds it flush, and sets the hammer aside for the final time. Its work now truly finished. The boots sit side by side on the dark oak of the bench, their soles a matched pair of quiet, functional maps, each one the mirror of the other, and the apprentice allows himself a moment of stillness. His hands rest on his thighs, the fingers slightly curled, and his breathing is slow and even, the rhythm of a body at rest after a long, sustained focus. The low lamplight flickers very gently, the flame bending for an instant, in a draught that is too weak to feel, and then it straightens again, burning with the steady teardrop shape that has accompanied the entire day. The grey light from the window has begun its slow, almost imperceptible decline toward evening, the brightness of the noon having passed, the rectangle of glass now holding a slightly deeper, more muted tone, the colour of unpolished pewter. The dust motes that drifted in the afternoon light have settled, and the air above the bench is clearer, the shadows in the corners of the room having crept outward by a small, patient degree. Now the apprentice reaches for the trimming knife. He draws it from its leather sheath with a single smooth pull, the blade emerging with a soft, oiled whisper that is over almost before it begins, and he holds it for a moment in his right hand, the ash handle settling into the familiar hollow of his palm, the brass ferrule a cool, buttery gleam against his skin. The blade is a long, slender curve of polished steel, its edge a hair-thin line of brighter silver that catches the lamplight and holds it in a narrow, continuous gleam. The shallow, moon-like hollow ground into each face of the blade reflects a distorted image of the window, a tiny, curved rectangle of grey light that slides along the steel as he turns the knife to check the edge. The edge is perfect, honed that morning on the leather strop that hangs from the peg on the wall, and he will cut the dense sole leather with the same ease that a spoon cuts through a soft custard, provided the hand that guides it is steady and patient. He picks up the first boot and turns it on its side, so that the edge of the sole faces upward, presenting the narrow strip of leather where the sole overhangs the upper by a small, even margin. This overhang is a necessary part of the construction, a deliberate excess of material that was left when the sole was first attached, and now it must be pared away so that the sole sits flush with the upper, creating a clean, smooth junction between the two parts. The apprentice holds the boot firmly in his left hand, his fingers wrapped around the heel and the instep, and he brings the knife to the leather with the same calm, deliberate care that he brought to the first hobnail of the morning. The blade touches the edge of the sole near the heel, the sharp point finding the exact angle where the sole meets the upper, and he begins to cut. The motion is a slow, continuous pull, the knife drawing toward him with a steady, even pressure that requires no sawing or forcing. The steel parts, the leather fibers with a soft, whispery sound, a sound that is not quite a hiss and not quite a crinkle, but something between the two, a gentle sighing note that speaks of the blade's effortless passage through the dense, tallow-softened hide. A thin sliver of leather begins to curl away from the sole, peeling upward like a fine, pale shaving from a carpenter's plane, and it follows the curve of the blade as the apprentice works his way around the heel, along the side, and toward the toe. The sliver is as thin as a piece of heavy paper, its inner face the same pale, waxy tan as the sole itself, its outer edge the slightly darker, rougher surface that was exposed to the air. It curls into a tight, spiral ribbon as it separates from the boot, a delicate, organic shape that seems almost too fine to be the product of so coarse a material as sole leather. The apprentice guides the knife with a hand that never hesitates, never wavers, the blade maintaining a constant angle, the cut proceeding in a single uninterrupted flow that follows the entire perimeter of the sole. When he reaches the toe, he does not stop. He continues around the other side, the sliver now several inches long and still attached, still peeling away in that same perfect curl, and he works his way back toward the heel, completing a full circuit of the boot. At the point where the cut began, the sliver finally detaches, and it falls to the flagstone floor with a sound so light it is barely a sound at all, a tiny, dry rustle like a leaf settling on still ground. The apprentice lifts the boot and inspects the trimmed edge, running his thumb along the junction where sole now meets upper in a clean, flush seam. The leather there is smooth and even, the cut surface showing the dense, compressed grain of the hide, a darker brown than the upper but matching it perfectly in contour so that the two pieces appear to grow from each other rather than being joined by thread and blue. He finds a single spot near the inside arch where the cut was a fraction less clean, a tiny, ragged fibre standing proud, and he shaves it away with the very tip of the blade, a minute, precise excision that removes the flaw without altering the line. Satisfied, he sets the first boot on the bench and picks up the second, turning it on its side as he did the first. The process repeats itself exactly, the blade touching the leather near the heel, the slow, steady pull beginning, the thin, pale sliver curling away from the sole in a single continuous ribbon. The sound of the cut is the same soft, whispery note, a sound that seems to belong to the same quiet family as the hammer taps and the creak of the spinning wheel, a sound that is gentle and unhurried and utterly without violence. The apprentice's face remains still, his eyes fixed on the point of the cut, his hand moving with the same patient, flowing motion that has governed every action of the day. The sliver grows longer, spiraling upward like a wood shaving, and when the circuit is complete, it detaches and falls to join the first on the flagstones, two pale coils resting together on the dark stone, the only waste produced by the morning's labor. The apprentice sets the second boot beside the first, both soles now trimmed and complete, the edges clean and flush, the hobnails glinting softly in the low light. He takes up the folded cloth and wipes the blade of the trimming knife carefully, drawing the cloth along the steel from the brass ferrule to the curved tip, removing any trace of tallow and leather dust that might have clung to the edge. The blade gleams with a fresh, polished brightness, and he slides it back into its leather sheath, the fit snug and soft, the sheath making a small breathy sound as it accepts the steel. He returns the knife to its place on the bench, setting it parallel with the edge, and then he takes the strop from its peg and runs the blade lightly over the leather surface a few times, a slow stroking motion that realigns the microscopic teeth of the edge, keeping it sharp for the next day's work. The strop makes a faint, rhythmic hiss with each pass, a sound like a gentle wave retreating across wet sand, and then it too is returned to its peg, hanging quietly against the wall. Now the boot sits side by side on the bench, and the apprentice does something he has not done all day. He stops working entirely. His hands are still, his tools are returned to their places, and his body settles more deeply onto the curved ash stool, his weight shifting into the worn, familiar hollow. He rests his forearms on the edge of the bench, his fingers loosely interlaced, and he looks at the boots. The lamplight falls across them in a soft yellow glow that warms the brown leather and makes the iron nail heads gleam with a dark, subdued luster. The window light, now definitely dimmer, casts a cooler, greyer illumination on the far side of the boots, and the two light sources meet across the soles, blending into a single muted radiance that seems to come from within the leather itself. He looks at the boots for a long moment, and his gaze moves slowly from one to the other, tracing the pattern of the hobnails, the clean, trimmed edges, the even, unblemished surfaces of the uppers that had been handled with care and remain free of scuffs. He notices nothing wrong because there is nothing wrong. Each nail is seated to the correct depth, each row follows the pencil line without deviation, each edge is flush and smooth, and the two boots are as alike as two objects made by hand can be. He notices nothing remarkable because there is nothing remarkable. These are workman's boots, built for durability and function, not for ornament or display, and their only beauty lies in their plain, honest soundness, the quality of having been made correctly from good materials by a steady hand. The apprentice's expression does not change. He does not smile or frown or sigh. He simply looks, and the looking itself is a quiet acknowledgement of a task completed, a small, private ceremony that requires no witnesses. You find yourself looking with him, your own gaze travelling over the boots, and you see in them the record of the day's patient labour. The outer nails trace the curve of the soles in a line that flows without interruption. The inner heel clusters sit in their neat rectangular grids, the trimmed edges are clean and true, and the leather carries the soft, waxed sheen of the tallow that was worked into it hours ago. The boots are simple things, objects of daily use that will soon be worn away on the cobbles of the city, their hobnails gradually flattened and polished by friction, their soles slowly ground thinner, and yet in this moment, sitting on the dark oak bench in the quiet of the fading afternoon, they are complete and perfect, a pair of finished things that required no more than patience and attention to bring into being. The apprentice untangles his fingers and places his hands flat on the bench, one on either side of the boots. He pushes himself back from the bench by a small distance, the stool creaking once, a soft, woody sound, and he rises to his feet with the same easy, unhurried motion that has characterized every movement of the day. He stands beside the bench for a moment, looking down at the boots from a slightly different angle, and then he reaches forward and picks them up, one in each hand, holding them by the heels, so that the soles face outward like two dark, iron-studded shields. He turns them this way and that, catching the lamplight, and then he sets them gently on the shelf below the bench, placing them side by side on the same board where they will wait for the workman who will collect them. A person whose name he may not know and whose face he may not see, but whose feet will be kept dry and steady by the work of his hands. The shelf holds the boots in their allotted space, the leather dark against the paler wood, the iron heads, a faint scattered constellation in the dimness beneath the bench. The apprentice straightens and lets his arms fall to his sides, his apron brushing against his knees, and he stands in the centre of the workshop, the stool behind him, the bench before him, the tools resting in their ordered places on the dark oak surface. The lamp burns on, the window dims by another small imperceptible degree, and the sounds of the close continue their slow, patient rhythm outside the door. The boots are finished, the work of the soul is complete, and the afternoon has settled into a deep, peaceful quiet that will hold for a little while longer, until the time comes to clean the bench and close the workshop for the night. For now there is only this moment, the finished boots resting in the dim light, the apprentice standing still, and the slow, calm satisfaction of a task done well. A satisfaction that asks for nothing more than to be left in peace. The work of the day is done, and the workshop settles into the quiet that follows completion. A quiet that is deeper and more restful than the quiet that accompanies labour. The boots rest on their shelf below the bench, their hobnails glinting faintly in the low lamplight, and the tools that have served the apprentice since the early morning lie scattered across the dark oak surface in the positions they have occupied for hours. Now comes the final task, a task that is not separate from the work, but a part of it, the slow, methodical putting away that returns the workshop to its state of readiness for the next morning. The apprentice stands beside the bench, his apron still tied at his waist, his hands still and loose at his sides, and he surveys the room with a quiet, unhurried gaze that notes everything that must be done. He begins with the floor. The flagstones around the stool and the bench have gathered a fine, scattered debris through the course of the day, the small, silent record of the work that has taken place, pale curls of leather trimmings, tiny fragments of broken twine, a dusting of iron scale from the hobnails, and the two long spiral slivers from the sole edges that lie coiled together near his left foot. The apprentice walks to the corner of the workshop where a hand brush and a wooden dustpan hang from a pair of hooks set into the stone wall, and he takes them down with the calm automatic motion of long habit. The brush is a simple thing, its handle a turned piece of beech darkened by the oil of many palms, its bristles a dense, stiff tuft of horsehair that has been cut flat across the bottom and slightly rounded at the corners. The bristles are a pale, tawny brown streaked with darker hairs, and they are worn down over time into a gentle, even curve that follows the contours of the flagstones. The dustpan is a shallow rectangular tray of pine, its edges dovetailed together with small, neat joints, its front lip a thin, beveled blade that fits flush against the floor when the pan is tilted forward, and its interior is smooth and pale, scuffed only lightly by the passage of countless sweepings. The apprentice returns to the area before the bench, the brush in his right hand and the dustpan in his left, and he lowers himself into a crouch, his knees bending without complaint, his back remaining straight and easy. He places the dustpan on the floor with its front lip pressed against a flagstone seam, and he begins to sweep. The stroke of the brush is a short, gentle motion, the bristles moving across the stone with a soft, whisking sound that is somewhere between a hush and a whisper, a sound that repeats itself in a slow, steady rhythm as he works his way outward from the center of the debris toward the waiting dustpan. The leather curls and the twine fragments gather before the bristles in a small, moving pile, and the iron scale, too fine to see individually, darkens the stone by a shade as it is collected. The two long sole slivers resist the first stroke, their spiral shapes catching on the uneven flagstone surface, and he picks them up by hand, his thumb and forefinger closing around them with the same careful pinch he used for the tiny leather curls earlier, depositing them gently into the dustpan where they lie coiled, like pale, thin ribbons. He works the brush into the shallow depression in the flagstone where his feet have rested through the day, that oval, hollow, polished smooth by generations of cobblers, and the bristles find a small accumulation of dark dust that has settled into the microscopic pores of the stone. The brush coaxes it out with a few short, brisk strokes, the sound a little sharper now, a crisp, dry whisk, whisk, whisk that bounces off the stone walls and fades quickly, and then he tilts the dustpan forward to receive the final sweep, the bristles pushing the last of the debris over the belled lip with a soft, final shush. He straightens up, the brush and dustpan held loosely in his hands, and he carries them to the door, stepping outside into the close for just long enough to empty the contents into the shallow, dark channel of the central gutter, where the next rain will carry the tiny fragments of leather and iron down the slope and out of sight. The dust falls into the gutter with a sound so faint it is barely a sound, a small dry patter that is over in an instant, and the gutter water, still trickling in its slow, patient way, accepts the offering without comment. He returns to the workshop and hangs the brush and dustpan on their hooks, the wooden handles clicking softly against the stone as they settle into place. The floor is now clean, the flagstones bare and even, their worn surfaces catching the lamplight in a low, polished sheen that shows the faint, ancient grain of the stone. The shallow depression before the bench is a little darker than the surrounding area, a permanent shadow worn into the mineral by countless feet, but it is clean of debris, the dust lifted away, the surface ready for another day's quiet standing. The apprentice turns from the wall and walks back to the bench, his soft leather soles making no sound on the flagstones, his body moving through the dim room with the ease of one who knows every inch of it in the dark. Now he turns his attention to the tallow pot. The small, unglazed vessel sits on the shelf above the bench where he left it hours ago, its wooden lid slightly askew from his last use, and he reaches for it with the same calm, certain motion with which he reaches for the hammer. He lifts the pot from the shelf and sets it on the bench. Then he takes up the folded cloth that has served him through the day, its surface now marked with pale smears of tallow and faint grey streaks of iron dust. He wipes the exterior of the pot first, passing the cloth around its curved sides to remove any trace of the fat that might have crept over the rim, and the rough, sandy surface of the clay catches on the cloth with a very faint, dry rasp. He lifts the wooden lid and wipes the inside edge of the pot where a ring of tallow has congealed, a thin, waxy deposit that comes away easily under the pressure of the cloth. And then he wipes the underside of the lid itself, that dark, glossy surface that has absorbed so much tallow over the years it has become permanently slick and dark. The lid goes back onto the pot with a soft, snug press of his thumb, and he returns the pot to its place on the shelf, aligned with its neighbors in a neat, orderly row. His own fingers now carry a thin, greasy film of tallow and iron dust, and he rubs them clean with the cloth, working the fabric between each finger in turn, into the webs and around the nails. A slow, thorough cleansing that leaves his skin dry and warm. The cloth, now thoroughly soiled, is folded once, twice, and set aside on the corner of the bench where it will be taken to the laundress at the end of the week, washed and dried and returned to service. A small, unremarkable cycle that repeats itself without thought or notice. The awls are next. They stand upright in their scrap leather block, the curved steel shafts gleaming with a faint bluish luster. The wooden handles a small, tight forest of beech and ash and rosewood. The apprentice draws each one from its hole with a gentle, straight pull, the steel sliding free of the leather with a very soft, smooth sound, a sound that speaks of the oil that has been worked into the block and the polished surface of the awls themselves. He examines each point in turn, holding it up to the lamplight and rotating it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, looking for any sign of a rolled tip or a dull spot that would require attention on the sharpening stone. The points are all fine and clean, the metal ending in a needle-sharp cone that gleams with a tiny bright star of reflected light, and he finds no flaws. He wipes each awl with the clean corner of the cloth, drawing the fabric from the handle down to the point in a single, smooth stroke that removes any invisible residue, and then he slots each one back into its place in the leather block, the shaft sinking into the snug, dark holes with a quiet, settled finality. The awl handles now stand in their neat arc, their woods glowing softly in the lamplight, the rosewood a dark, rich note among the paler ashen beech, and the apprentice takes the leather block as a whole and moves it to the back of the shelf, where it will sit undisturbed until the next morning. The bench top, once crowded with the small forest of handles, is now a little barer, the dark oak surface opening up as each item is put away. He reaches for the lasting pincer, that heavy, double-handled tool with its blunt iron hooks, and he wipes it down with the cloth, cleaning the curved jaws of any leather dust that might have clung to the cross-hatched inner faces, polishing the dark iron until it shows a dull, even gleam. The wooden handles receive a pass of the cloth as well, the beech surfaces already so smooth from years of palm friction that they need no more than a light dusting. And then the pincer is hung on its hook on the wall beside the bench, the iron jaws facing downward, the handles slightly apart, ready to be grasped at a moment's need. The trimming knife is already sheathed, its long curved blade nestled in the dark leather guard, but the apprentice draws it out one more time to wipe the steel with a fresh, clean corner of the cloth, ensuring that no moisture from the tallow has crept onto the edge. The blade gleams with a perfect, silvery brightness, and he slides it home into the sheath with that same soft, breathy sound, the leather accepting the steel, like a hand accepting a familiar tool. The sheathed knife is placed on the shelf beside the awl block, its ash handle aligned with the edge, its brass ferrule catching the lamplight in a single warm flash. The ball of hemp twine is returned to its dish, the loose end tucked under the last winding so that it will not unravel, and the lump of beeswax goes back into its shallow wooden bowl. The clay pots of tallow, of iron filings, of resinous pitch are all checked, their lids pressed down firmly, their exteriors wiped clean, and they sit in their row on the shelf like small, patient sentinels, their rough, unglazed surfaces a quiet brown against the darker stone of the wall. Now the apprentice comes to the hammer, the tool that has been his close companion through the long hours of the day, and he lifts it from its leather rest with a hand that knows its weight and balance as intimately as it knows the shape of its own fingers. He wipes the iron head with the cloth, polishing the slightly domed face until it shows a clean, even silver. Then he wipes the ash handle, drawing the cloth along its length in a slow, firm stroke that removes the faint, powdery residue of iron scale that has settled on the wood. The small leather cord that passes through the hole at the end of the handle dangles loosely, and he hooks it over the peg on the wall, letting the hammer hang there with its head downward, a position it has occupied every night since the apprentice first began to learn the craft. The hammer swings very slightly for a moment, a tiny pendulum motion that is over almost immediately, and then it is still, its work complete, its weight held securely by the peg and the cord and the quiet dark of the wall. The hobnail box is the last item to be put away. The wooden container still holds a scattering of unused nails, those that were selected and then returned to the box, or those that were never needed, and they lie in a dark, jumbled heap at the bottom. The apprentice lifts the box and tilts it gently, listening to the sound of the nails sliding across the wooden interior. A faint, dry, raining sound that is like very small hail falling on a distant roof. A sound that is both metallic and dull, iron on wood, each tiny impact a soft individual note that merges with its neighbors into a single, continuous rustle. He does not tip the nails out. He simply listens for a moment, the sound telling him how many remain, a rough estimate that is more than a guess and less than a count. A knowledge that comes from long familiarity. Satisfied that there are enough for the beginning of the next day's work, he slides the lid closed with a soft, dry rasp and sets the box on the shelf below the bench, beside the finished boots, where it will wait through the night. The bench is now nearly empty. The tools are gone, returned to their hooks and their pegs and their places on the shelf, and the dark oak surface stretches from one side of the bench to the other in an unbroken, quiet plane. The apprentice takes the cloth in his hand and wipes the entire surface of the bench, a long, sweeping motion that starts at the back and moves toward the front, gathering any remaining dust or fragments that might have escaped the earlier cleaning. The cloth passes over the shallow scratches and the tiny nicks, the faint map of 1,000 working days, and it leaves behind a surface that is clean and dry and faintly glossy, the patina of age and use shining softly in the lamplight. He folds the cloth for the final time and sets it on the corner of the bench, a small, neat square of soiled linen that will wait for washing. The stool is the last thing he touches. He places his hand on the curved ash seat, feeling the familiar, polished hollow that has been shaped by his own body and the bodies of those who came before him, and he pushes it gently under the bench, sliding it into its resting place. The 3 legs scraped very softly on the flagstones, a low, woody sound that lasts only a second, and then the stool is tucked away, its seat hidden beneath the overhang of the bench top, its legs a dark tripod in the shadow. The floor before the bench is now an empty oval of warmed stone, the shallow depression visible as a slight, darker patch in the grey light, a quiet memorial to the cobbler who worked there yesterday and the day before and who will work there again tomorrow. The apprentice unties the leather apron from his waist, lifting the loop over his head with both hands, and he hangs it on a peg beside the door where it will air through the night. Without the apron, his linen shirt and plain wool trousers seem lighter, the fabric moving more freely against his skin, and he rolls his shoulders once, a small, slow rotation that loosens the muscles that have been still for so long. The close outside the open door is now dimmer, the grey light having faded to a deeper, softer tone, the colour of smoke and shadow, and the air that drifts into the workshop carries the faint, cool scent of evening, a scent of stone and dampness, and the distant clean smell of water running in the gutter. He stands in the centre of the room for a moment, his hands resting on his hips, his breathing slow and even, and he looks around at the workshop. The bench is clean and bare, the tools are stored, the floor is swept, the lamp still burns with its steady teardrop flame. Everything is in its place, and the room has a settled, peaceful quality, a readiness for rest that mirrors the apprentice's own quiet fatigue. He reaches up and adjusts the wick of the oil lamp, turning it down slightly so that the flame shrinks from a teardrop to a small, steady bead of yellow light, a flame that will burn safely through the night without consuming too much oil, a small, warm presence in the darkness. The light dims by a shade, and the shadows in the corners of the room grow a little deeper, a little softer, folding around the shelves and the pegs in the empty bench like a blanket being drawn up over a sleeping form. The apprentice walks to the door, his steps slow and quiet on the clean flagstones, and he pauses in the doorway, his silhouette a dark shape against the grey light of the close. He turns and looks back into the workshop one final time, his gaze travelling over the bench, the stool, the shelf of clay pots, the hammer hanging on its peg, the boots resting on their shelf. Everything is as it should be. Everything is ready, and the room holds the quiet promise of the next morning. The next nail, the next boot, the next long, slow arc of the hammer, rising and falling in the grey light. He steps out into the close, the cool air folding around him, and he pulls the heavy oak door closed behind him with a soft, woody thump that echoes very briefly between the stone walls and then is gone, leaving the workshop in its own deep, patient silence. You stand in the narrow close as the day withdraws, the grey light of afternoon giving way to a deeper, softer dimness that seems to rise from the cobblestones themselves, rather than descend from the strip of sky above. The workshop door behind you is closed, its heavy oak planks fitted flush against the stone frame, and no light escapes from the small, thick-glassed window, the interior having dimmed to a low, steady bead of yellow flame that will burn through the night untended. The quiet that had lived inside the workshop all day has now seeped out into the passage, mingling with the larger quiet of the close, and together they create a stillness that is complete, unbroken by hammer or awl, or the soft brush of a hand on leather. You take a step away from the door and feel the coolness of the evening air settle against your skin. A coolness that carries the first hint of the night to come, a night that will lay its damp hand on the stones and the roofs and the iron gutters, holding everything in a dark, patient silence until the dawn returns. The light that remains is a muted, pearlescent grey, the colour of wood ash after the fire has gone out, and it comes not from any visible sun, but from a general, fading glow that seems to hang in the air itself. A residue of the day that is being gently drained away. The ribbon of sky between the high eaves has deepened from pewter to a soft, blue-grey slate, and if you look up, you can see a single, faint star beginning to show itself in the eastern gap. A tiny, steady point of cold light that appears to hang directly above the close, looking down with an ancient, unblinking patience. The walls that rise on either side have darkened as well, their dressed sandstone faces losing the silvery undertone of the afternoon, and taking on a warmer, smokier hue, the colour of burnt sugar or a very dark tea, and the small patches of olive lichen are now invisible, merged into the general shadow. The air moves slowly in the close, a gentle, almost imperceptible drift that flows downhill toward the cowgate, and it carries with it the scent of evening fires. From chimneys high above, thin streams of smoke are beginning to rise, the first fires of the evening meal being lit in grates and hearths throughout the tenements, and the smoke curls downward into the close because the air is cooling and the draught pulls it into the narrow channel rather than lifting it away. The smoke is a soft blue-grey veil that drifts between the walls at the level of the second story, and as it descends it brings the smell of peat, a sweet, earthy, mossy scent that is the true breath of the city at dusk, a smell that speaks of the dark wet hills where the peat was cut and the long, slow journey it made on a cart to this close. Mingled with the peat smoke is the faint, warm smell of oat porridge, a smell that is both plain and comforting, the smell of water and grain simmering together in an iron pot on a low fire, and it drifts from a dozen small windows, blending into the general fragrance of the evening, a fragrance that is domestic, unhurried, and quiet. You walk a few paces down the slope, your leather soles meeting the cobblestones with a soft, flat sound that the close absorbs without echo. The stones underfoot are cool now, the day's mild warmth having fled from them into the air, and they are faintly damp, not wet, but carrying a thin, invisible film of moisture that has condensed out of the cooling atmosphere, a dark bloom that makes the surfaces slightly slick and deepens the colors of the stone. The worn polish of the cobbles catches the last grey light in a low, silky gleam, and the seams between them, those narrow channels of packed earth and ancient dust, are dark and cool, holding the dampness a little longer than the stone. You notice that one cobble near the central gutter is slightly loose, a fractional movement under your foot that produces a very soft, woody clink, and then it settles, its bed of earth and rubble still holding it firm enough for the next 100 years. The iron gutter that runs down the centre of the close is still doing its quiet work. The trickle of water you heard in the afternoon has not ceased, but has slowed to a bare, continuous movement. a thin, dark ribbon of liquid that slides over the smooth, concave stone of the channel with a sound like a very distant sigh. The water is faintly grey, carrying a small amount of fine silt and the last traces of dishwater from the evening washing up, and it gives off a cool, metallic scent, the scent of stone and iron, and the faint, clean taint of soap made from wood ash and tallow. As you pause beside the gutter, you see a single small bubble form against the edge of a stone, a tiny, perfect dome of clear film that trembles for a moment, catches the pale light, and then bursts with a minute, inaudible pop, returning to the flow. The trickle continues, as it will continue through the night, a constant, patient sound beneath the larger silence of the close. A window shutter closes somewhere above you, the sound sudden but soft, a single, muffled thud of wood against stone that seems to come from the fourth story of the tenement on the western side. The sound travels down the close with a brief hollow resonance, and then it is gone, leaving behind a silence that is marginally deeper than before. You look up and see the dark rectangle of the window where a moment ago a faint, warm glow of candlelight had been visible. And now there is only the blank shuttered surface, the wood painted a dark, faded green that is barely distinguishable from the stone in the dim light. The shutter has been closed by a hand that did it without hurry, a hand that knows the latch and the bolt as well as the apprentice knows his hammer, and you imagine the small, quiet motion that accompanied it, the arm reaching out, the fingers finding the iron ring, the pull that brought the two leaves together with a firm but gentle pressure, the sliding of the bolt into its keeper. The image fades, and the shuttered window remains. A dark eye closed to the night, a woman's voice speaks a few calm words from that same high window, the sound drifting down through the layered air of the close with a muffled, soft-edged clarity, like a stone wrapped in wool dropped into still water. You cannot understand the words, only the tone, which is low and even and unhurried, a voice that is perhaps telling a child to settle into bed or reminding a husband to bank the fire, a voice that carries no urgency, no excitement, only the quiet, domestic authority of the evening. A second voice answers, this one deeper and fainter, a murmur that is more felt than heard, and then the voices cease, the window having closed its shutter and its mouth, the household sealed up for the night. The close receives the silence back with a patient, indifferent stillness. You continue your slow walk down the slope, your steps carrying you past the other doorways that line the passage, each one a dark, low rectangle of heavy oak, fitted with iron hinges and studded with nail heads that have been blackened by age. Some of the doorways show a thin line of warm yellow light along the bottom edge, the sign of a candle or a fire still burning within, while others are dark, the inhabitants already asleep or away. From one door comes the very faint, high sound of a child's laugh, a brief silvery note that is cut off quickly as if the child has been gently shushed, and then the silence returns, thicker than before. From another door, the low, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair or a cradle, a sound that is so steady it seems to be part of the structure of the building, a sound that has been continuing for so long that it has become indistinguishable from the quiet. The smoke from the evening fires has thickened slightly, the blue-grey veils now hanging lower between the walls, and the scent of peat is stronger here, mingling now with the sharper, slightly acrid smell of coal from a chimney. Further down the close, a thin sulphuric note that cuts through the sweetness of the peat, and then fades. The combined smoke drifts around you as you walk, catching in your throat with a faint, clean tickle, and you breathe it in, the smell of 1,000 Edinburgh evenings, each one the same, each one a slow, quiet passage from light to dark. The cobblestones beneath your feet have changed texture now, the central portion of the close having been laid with a patch of smaller, rounder stones that fit together like the pebbles on a riverbed, and they are slightly more uneven, their surfaces worn into shallow, dimpled hollows that hold the dampness in tiny dark pools no larger than a thumbprint. You step carefully, your feet finding the natural rhythm of the slope, and the sound of your footsteps is a soft, muted scuff that blends with the trickle of the gutter and the distant fading murmur of the city above. Ahead of you the close bends slightly to the right, curving around a projecting stair turret that has stood there since the reign of the last Stuart king, and you round the bend into a stretch of the passage that is darker still, the high walls blocking even the grey, failing light from the sky. Here, the lamps have not yet been lit, or perhaps they are not needed, the residents of this part of the close having gone to their rest without them, and the darkness has a thick, velvety quality, a darkness that seems to press gently against your eyes. You pause for a moment, letting your vision adjust, and slowly the outlines of the walls and the doorways emerge, the faint phosphorescent glow of the lichen on the stone becoming visible as a very faint, greenish-grey tracery. The glint of the iron gutter running like a thin, dark snake along the ground. In this deeper darkness, the sounds of the close become clearer, the trickle of water more distinct, the distant creak of the signboard on a high street now a slow, irregular pulse that seems to be winding down for the night, the creaks coming further apart as the breeze dies. From somewhere very close, you hear the soft, sudden flutter of a bird settling into a roost in the eaves. A single, rapid rustle of wings that is over in a fraction of a second, and then the small, contented chirp of the bird settling its feathers. A tiny, intimate sound that is swallowed by the stone walls and held there. You stand still and listen, and the quiet that follows seems to expand outward, filling the close from wall to wall, from cobblestone to sky. A quiet that is not empty but layered, a quiet made of stone and smoke, and the slow, patient breathing of the sleeping city. You turn and look back up the close toward the high street. The strip of sky above is now a deep indigo blue, the single star you saw earlier having been joined by two others, 3 cold points of light in a diagonal line, and the faintest glow of the rising moon, not yet visible above the rooftops, touches the topmost chimney pots with a thin, silvery edge. The smoke from the fires rises into this dark sky and is lost, becoming part of the general, soft darkness, and the scent of oat porridge has faded, replaced now by the cooler, cleaner scent of the night air, a scent of damp stone and distance and the faint, saline taste of the sea that lies beyond the city, invisible but always present. The close at this hour is a place of profound rest, a long, narrow room whose ceiling is the sky and whose walls are the accumulated centuries, and it holds you in its quiet without demand, without expectation, simply a calm, waiting presence that asks nothing more than your stillness. A final sound reaches your ears, a sound so faint you might have imagined it. It is the distant, ghostly echo of a very small hammer, a soft, metallic tick, followed by another and another, the memory of the cobblestone apprentice's day labour that still lingers in the close, even though the hammer itself has hung on its peg for 2 hours now, silent and still. You know it is not a real sound, only the trick of a quiet mind playing back the rhythm that filled the day, and yet it seems to come from the stones themselves, from the very fabric of the close, as if the walls and the cobbles and the iron gutter have absorbed the patient tapping and are releasing it now, incrementally, into the night. The sound fades as you listen, the ticks growing further apart, softer, until they merge with the trickle of the water and the slow, deep silence, and then they are gone, leaving behind only the quiet and the dark and the cool, damp air. The close settles into its night. The workshop doors are closed, the shutters are latched, the fires have burned down to embers, and the people who live above and behind the stone walls have drawn their blankets up and closed their eyes. The apprentice has gone to his own bed somewhere in another part of the city, walking through the dark streets with the easy, quiet stride of a young man whose body is tired in a good, honest way, his hands still carrying the faint, tactile memory of the hammer handle and the hobnail heads. The boots he made sit on their shelf below the bench, their soles studded with iron, waiting for the workman who will claim them and wear them on the wet cobbles, and they require nothing now but the passage of time and the slow, patient friction of walking to finish what the apprentice began. The close holds all of this in its deep, patient memory, the way it holds the polish of the cobbles and the worn hollow of the flagstone and the faint, ghostly tracery of ancient signboards. And it asks nothing in return, only to be left in peace as the night deepens and the city sleeps. The moon rises above the rooftops, a pale silver-white crescent that hangs in the narrow strip of sky, and its light falls into the close for the first time that day, a thin, cold radiance that touches the topmost edges of the eastern wall and then slides downward, inch by slow inch, illuminating the rough, pitted stone and the dark, empty windows and the central gutter with its thin, patient trickle of water. The light is too weak to cast shadows, only a faint silvery sheen that makes the cobblestones look like the backs of sleeping fish, and it moves with a slowness that is almost imperceptible, the movement of the moon itself, pulling the light down the wall as the night advances. By the time the moon has risen high enough to touch the workshop door, the close will be in its deepest, coldest hour. The hour before the first grey light of dawn begins to seep back into the sky, and the door will still be closed, the hammer still on its peg, the bench still empty, waiting with a patient, wooden stillness for the apprentice to return and begin the day again. You stand in the close a moment longer, your breath a very faint, pale mist in the cooling air, and you let the quiet settle around you like a heavy, wool cloak. The sounds of the city are now so distant they are barely sounds at all, only a low, continuous rustle that might be the wind moving through the high street or the far-off sigh of the sea. A rustle that is less a noise than a presence, a gentle pressure on the ear. The trickle of the gutter water continues. The damp cobblestones gleam faintly under the moon, and the smoke from the dying fires drifts in the last, lazy veils before dispersing into the dark. The narrow Edinburgh close, this stone channel that has seen centuries of mornings and evenings, of hammer taps and spinning wheels, and the soft carrying voices of women at their windows, holds you in its quiet with the same calm, unjudging acceptance that it shows to all things. And you know that when you leave, the silence will remain, unbroken, until the first small tick of the cobbler's hammer marks the beginning of another ordinary day.